Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we descend into the depths of medieval Europe, into places where sunlight rarely touched stone, where justice wore a cruel mask, and where the screams of the accused echoed through cold, damp corridors. This is the story of medieval torture and punishment, a dark chapter in human history that reveals both the brutality of our ancestors and the evolution of our modern concepts of justice and human rights. As you settle into comfort and prepare for rest, we will explore these difficult truths together, examining not with sensationalism, but with the careful eye of historical understanding. Before we begin our descent into these dark dungeons, let me assure you, while our subject is somber, our approach will be measured and thoughtful. We seek to understand, not to glorify. We aim to educate, not to disturb your rest. The past, no matter how dark, has lessons to teach us about how far we have come, and how vigilant we must remain to protect the rights and dignities we now hold dear. So breathe deeply, settle into your pillows, and let us walk together through the stone corridors of medieval justice, where torchlight flickers against ancient walls, and the wheels of punishment turned with terrible certainty. To understand medieval torture and punishment, we must first step entirely outside our modern framework of justice. We must leave behind our concepts of human rights, of innocent until proven guilty, of proportional punishment. We must enter a world where the very structure of society, the understanding of crime and sin, and the purpose of punishment were fundamentally different from our own. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a time when the separation between church and state, between sin and crime, between earthly justice and divine judgment, was blurred or non-existent. To commit a crime was not merely to break a law, it was to upset the divine order, to sin against God Himself, and to tear at the very fabric that held society together. In this worldview, punishment served multiple purposes, none of which aligned neatly with our modern concepts of rehabilitation or deterrence. Punishment was retribution, yes, but it was also spectacle, purification, and proof of divine judgment. The body of the criminal became a text upon which society wrote its values, a canvas upon which the consequences of transgression were painted in blood and bruises for all to see. The medieval legal system was not a single, unified code. It was a patchwork of Roman law, Germanic customs, canon law from the church, and local traditions that varied from kingdom to kingdom, from duchy to duchy, sometimes from village to village. But certain threads ran through this tapestry of justice, certain assumptions that would seem alien to modern eyes. First among these was the belief in ordeal and trial by combat as legitimate ways to determine guilt or innocence. This was not primitive superstition, but a logical extension of medieval theology. If God was all-knowing and all-powerful, if He concerned Himself with the affairs of men, then surely He would intervene to protect the innocent and condemn the guilty. A person who could hold a red-hot iron without being burned, who could sink when thrown into water rather than float, who could prevail in armed combat despite lesser skill, these were signs of divine favor, proof of innocence that no human testimony could contradict. Second was the concept of confession as the queen of proofs. A confession was worth more than any evidence, more valuable than any witness testimony. This placed enormous pressure on the legal system to extract confessions, and it was this pressure that gave rise to the systematic use of torture as an investigative tool. If a confession was needed, and the accused refused to provide one, then methods must be found to loosen their tongue. Third was the public nature of punishment. In an age before mass media, before widespread literacy, the execution of justice had to be visible, had to be spectacular, had to be memorable. Punishment was pedagogy, a lesson written large for all to see. The scaffold, the pillory, the public flogging, these were not merely punishments but performances, carefully staged productions meant to reinforce social order and demonstrate the power of authority. Fourth was the principle of proportional punishment, though proportional meant something very different than it does today. The punishment must fit not just the crime, but the criminal. A noble who committed theft faced different consequences than a peasant who committed the same act. A first offense was treated differently than a repeat transgression. The social order was hierarchical, and justice reflected and reinforced that hierarchy at every turn. Let us begin with the spaces where this justice was administered: the dungeons, the torture chambers, the prisons that held those awaiting trial and punishment. The word dungeon itself comes from the Old French donjon, meaning the great tower or keep of a castle. But over time, it came to refer specifically to the underground chambers and cells where prisoners were held, often in conditions of profound misery. Imagine descending a narrow spiral staircase, your hand trailing along cold stone walls slick with moisture. The air grows colder with each step, damper, carrying the smell of mold and human waste, and something else, the particular odor of despair that seems to seep from the very stones. At the bottom of these stairs, in the bowels of a castle or fortress, the dungeon awaits. Medieval dungeons varied enormously in their construction and conditions, but certain features were common to many. Stone walls, often weeping with moisture from their position below the water table. Minimal light, perhaps filtering through a small barred window at ground level, or provided only by torches and candles. Floors of packed earth or rough stone, often covered with filthy straw that was changed infrequently, if at all. The cells themselves came in different varieties, each with its own particular form of misery. The bottle dungeon, found in some Scottish castles, was shaped like a bottle with a narrow neck at the top. Prisoners were lowered through this opening and could not climb out without assistance. The rounded walls made it impossible to stand comfortably or lie flat, and the constant damp darkness was enough to drive many prisoners to madness even before any formal torture began. The oubliette, from the French oublier meaning to forget, was perhaps the most terrible form of dungeon. This was a cell, often bottle-shaped, into which prisoners were placed and then simply forgotten. The only opening was at the top, through which the prisoner was lowered, and occasionally food might be dropped. There was no sanitation, no light, no human contact. Prisoners might languish for months or even years in such conditions, and many died there, their bodies left to decompose until their bones were cleared away to make room for new occupants. Standard cells, while less exotic, were no less miserable. They were typically small, perhaps 8 by 10 feet, and might hold multiple prisoners. There were usually no beds. Prisoners slept on the floor, often chained to the walls. Sanitation was non-existent. A bucket in the corner was the best one could hope for, and often prisoners simply relieved themselves on the floor or in the straw. The temperature in these underground chambers was constantly cold and damp. Prisoners often suffered from what we would now recognize as rheumatism, arthritis, and respiratory diseases. Tuberculosis was rampant in medieval prisons, spreading easily in the confined, poorly ventilated spaces. Skin diseases were common, as were infestations of lice, fleas, and rats. Food in medieval dungeons was minimal and of poor quality. Bread and water were standard fare, with perhaps thin gruel or soup on occasion. The amount provided was calculated to keep prisoners alive, not to maintain their health or strength. Wealthy prisoners or those with family support might receive better food brought from outside, but for most, slow starvation was part of the punishment, even before any formal sentence was passed. But the physical conditions, as terrible as they were, represented only one form of suffering. Medieval dungeons were also places of psychological torment, where prisoners might wait for weeks or months before trial, never knowing when they might be called for interrogation or what methods might be used to extract their confession. The waiting was its own form of torture. In the darkness, with only the occasional sound of guards passing, the screams of other prisoners being tortured elsewhere, or the scuttling of rats, the mind could conjure terrors far worse than reality. Prisoners would have heard stories of the tortures that awaited them, rumors that grew and twisted in the telling. The anticipation of pain, the uncertainty, the complete lack of control over one's fate, these psychological torments were carefully cultivated by the system. Some dungeons had special features designed to enhance suffering. The Little Ease at the Tower of London was a cell too small to stand up in and too narrow to lie down in comfortably. Prisoners could only crouch or sit in a hunched position, and after even a short time, the physical agony became unbearable. This was not torture in the technical sense. No implements were used, no violence was done, but the effect was profound physical and mental anguish. Water dungeons existed in some locations, where the floor was deliberately kept flooded with a few inches of water, or where high tide would flood the cell partially. Prisoners had to stand or find some way to keep themselves above the water level, leading to exhaustion and hypothermia. The sensory deprivation of the dungeon should not be underestimated as a form of suffering. Humans are social creatures, adapted for light and sound and interaction. To be plunged into near total darkness, to hear only distant, echoing sounds, to have no human contact except with guards who viewed you as already condemned, this could break a person's spirit as effectively as any rack or wheel. Some prisoners went mad in these conditions, and their madness was often taken as evidence of guilt or as a sign of possession by demons. There are records of prisoners who began speaking to themselves, who developed elaborate delusions, who lost track of time completely. Some became catatonic, some became violent, and some simply seemed to withdraw into themselves, no longer responding to any external stimulus. The keepers of these dungeons were often as brutal as the conditions. Jailers in the medieval period were not salaried officials, but rather individuals who had purchased or been granted the right to keep the prison. They made their money by charging prisoners for everything: for food, for water, for cleaner straw, for the removal of chains, for any small comfort or privilege. Wealthy prisoners might buy themselves relatively decent conditions, while the poor suffered extremes of deprivation. There was little oversight of these jailers, and abuse was common. Sexual assault of female prisoners was endemic and rarely punished. Prisoners might be beaten for entertainment or to extort money from family members. The weak could be victimized by stronger prisoners with the tacit approval of the jailers, who might find it amusing or who simply did not care. Yet amidst this darkness, there were occasional glimmers of humanity. Some jailers, despite the brutality of the system, showed mercy to their charges. There are records of jailers who provided extra food from their own supplies, who allowed family visits beyond what was required, who eased the suffering of the dying. These acts of kindness, small as they were, stand out in the historical record precisely because they were exceptions to the general rule of callousness and cruelty. Religious prisoners sometimes fared better than common criminals, particularly if they had been imprisoned for heresy rather than secular crimes. The church had its own prisons, and while they were no luxury accommodations, they were sometimes less brutal than secular dungeons. Monks and priests who ran these prisons were expected to show some degree of Christian charity, though this was not always the case. The length of time a prisoner might spend in these conditions before trial varied enormously. The wheels of medieval justice turned slowly, and there was no right to a speedy trial. A prisoner might languish for weeks, months, or even years before their case was heard. Some died before trial, their bodies buried in unmarked graves or simply thrown into pits. Others went mad or became so ill that they could barely stand at their own trials. For those awaiting execution rather than trial, the dungeon was the last space they would inhabit on earth. Some spent these final days in prayer, seeking to make peace with God before facing their fate. Others raged against their circumstances. Some tried to escape, though success was rare, and the punishment for failed escape attempts was terrible. The condemned sometimes received visits from priests who would hear their confessions and offer them the consolations of religion. This was considered a mercy, a chance to save one's soul, even if the body was forfeit. These final confessions were sometimes used as evidence against others, as dying declarations were considered particularly trustworthy. In some jurisdictions, prisoners awaiting execution were marked in some way, perhaps by the clothing they wore, or by being kept in a particular cell. Everyone who saw them would know their fate, and this public knowledge was part of the punishment. The condemned man or woman became a living example of what awaited those who broke the law, a walking memento mori for the community. The dungeons of the medieval period were more than just holding cells, they were instruments of justice themselves, spaces designed to break the spirit, to encourage confession, to punish through privation and suffering. They were the dark foundation upon which the visible spectacle of medieval justice was built, the hidden spaces where many of the era's truths about power, cruelty, and human endurance were written in suffering and stone. As we continue our journey through medieval torture and punishment, we carry with us the image of these dungeons, the understanding that the formal tortures and executions we will discuss were preceded by weeks or months of suffering in these dark, cold, forsaken places. To understand how torture became not just accepted, but legally mandated in medieval Europe, we must examine the evolution of legal systems and the particular pressures that led to torture's codification. In the early medieval period, roughly from the 5th to the 11th centuries, legal procedures in much of Europe relied heavily on accusatorial systems. When someone was accused of a crime, the case would be decided through various methods: compurgation, where the accused would gather oath helpers to swear to their innocence; trial by ordeal, where God's judgment was sought through physical tests; or trial by combat, where guilt or innocence was determined by battle. These methods shared a common feature: they did not require extensive investigation or the gathering of evidence as we understand it today. They were, in a sense, shortcuts to judgment, ways of determining guilt or innocence without the messy business of investigation and proof. But beginning in the 12th and 13th centuries, things began to change. The revival of Roman law studies at universities like Bologna brought new ideas about jurisprudence to Western Europe. The Church, through the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, prohibited clergy from participating in trials by ordeal, effectively ending that practice in much of Christendom. New forms of proof and procedure were needed. The system that emerged was the inquisitorial system, so named not because it was limited to the Church's Inquisition, but because it was based on the principle of inquire inquisitio in Latin. Under this system, authorities would investigate crimes, gather evidence, question witnesses, and build a case. This was a more rational, more evidence-based approach than what had come before. However, this new system brought with it a particular problem. In Roman law, which served as the model for much of this new jurisprudence, there were strict standards for conviction. You could not convict someone based on circumstantial evidence alone, no matter how compelling. You needed either the testimony of 2 eyewitnesses to the crime or a confession by the accused. This created an obvious difficulty. Many crimes have no eyewitnesses. Murder, for instance, is typically committed in private. Theft, fraud, heresy, these might be perpetrated in ways that left no witnesses. Yet if confession was the only path to conviction, how could one obtain that confession from an accused person who maintained their innocence? The answer, according to the legal scholars of the time, was torture. If properly applied, under strict legal guidelines, torture could extract the truth from the guilty, while the innocent would be sustained by God to resist. Or so the theory went. Thus began the legal codification of torture. The process was gradual, but by the 13th century, torture had become an accepted and regulated part of legal procedure in much of continental Europe. It's important to note that England largely avoided this development, maintaining its common law system and generally prohibiting torture, except in extraordinary cases involving treason or state security. The regulations surrounding torture were extensive, and on paper at least, quite restrictive. Torture was not to be applied lightly or randomly. There had to be what was called half-proof substantial evidence suggesting guilt. This might include the testimony of 1 eyewitness, significant circumstantial evidence, or the person being caught in suspicious circumstances. Only certain people could authorize torture. Typically, this required a judge or magistrate of appropriate rank. The torture had to be conducted in the presence of officials who would document the proceedings. A scribe would record everything: the questions asked, the answers given, the methods used, the duration of torture. There were also, theoretically, limits on who could be tortured. Young children were exempt, as were the very elderly. Pregnant women were not to be tortured. Knights and nobles had certain protections, though these could be overcome in cases of serious crimes. Clergy had special protections under canon law. The torture itself was to be applied in carefully calibrated degrees, starting with the threat of torture, then moving to lighter methods, and only escalating if the accused continued to maintain their innocence. The torturer was expected to be skilled, to know how to inflict pain without causing death or permanent injury that would prevent the accused from standing trial. Perhaps most importantly, Confessions obtained under torture were not considered valid unless they were repeated freely afterward, without torture or the threat of torture. The accused would be removed from the torture chamber, given time to recover, and then asked to confirm their confession. If they recanted, they could theoretically be tortured again, but there were supposed to be limits on how many times this could occur. These regulations might seem to suggest a humane system, a careful balance between the need for justice and the rights of the accused. In practice, however, they were honored more in the breach than the observance. The requirement for half-proof could be met by very thin evidence. The testimony of a single witness of questionable character, the fact that someone had been seen near the scene of a crime, even malicious gossip could be enough to justify torture. Once authorities decided that someone was guilty and wanted a confession, the legal requirements could be satisfied with little difficulty. The prohibition on torturing certain classes of people, nobles, clergy, children, was often ignored when the crime was serious enough, or when the authorities were sufficiently motivated. There are numerous records of these protections being set aside. The restriction on repeated torture was easily circumvented. Instead of torturing someone multiple times, the session would simply be continued or extended. Technically, it was all one session of torture, even if it spanned multiple days or weeks. The requirement that confessions be repeated freely was perhaps the most cynically observed. An accused person would be tortured until they confessed, then removed from the torture chamber. They would be warned that if they recanted their confession, they would be tortured again, and the torture would be more severe. Under these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that most confessions were freely confirmed. The presence of officials and the keeping of records, rather than being safeguards, often served to legitimize the process. The detailed documentation of torture sessions describing the methods used, the duration, the words spoken provided a legal veneer to proceedings that were often little more than exercises in brutality. The skill of the torturer was a double-edged sword. Yes, a skilled torturer could extract confessions without killing the subject, which was desirable from a legal standpoint. But this skill also meant that torture could be prolonged, that pain could be maximized while physical damage was minimized, that suffering could be calibrated with terrible precision. Different regions developed different legal codes governing torture, but the essential elements were similar. The Carolina, promulgated by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1532, provided a comprehensive criminal code that included detailed provisions for torture. It specified the crimes for which torture could be used, the evidence required, the procedures to be followed. This code remained influential in parts of Central Europe for centuries. In France, the practice of torture was regulated by various royal ordinances. The most significant was perhaps the Criminal Ordinance of 1670, which codified existing practices and remained in force until torture was formally abolished in 1788. This ordinance distinguished between preparatory torture, question préparatoire, used to extract confessions, and preliminary torture, question préalable, used after conviction to force the condemned to reveal accomplices or stolen goods. In Italy, the procedures varied from city-state to city-state, but torture was widely used throughout the peninsula. The Italian legal scholars, who had helped revive Roman law, also helped systematize the use of torture, writing treatises that discussed the fine points of when and how torture should be applied. Spain developed its own distinctive legal framework for torture, particularly in the context of the Spanish Inquisition. While the Inquisition has acquired a reputation for exceptional cruelty, the reality was more complex. The Inquisition was actually relatively restrained in its use of torture compared to secular courts of the same period. It kept meticulous records, limited the duration and severity of torture, and had lower rates of execution than many secular jurisdictions. The ecclesiastical courts of the Church had their own complicated relationship with torture. Canon law had traditionally prohibited clergy from participating in bloodshed, which created a problem when it came to torture. The solution was typically to have secular authorities carry out the torture on behalf of the Church, allowing churchmen to maintain the fiction that they kept their hands clean. This legal framework, the codes, the regulations, the procedures, served multiple functions. On one level, it genuinely did provide some limits on torture, some protections for the accused, however inadequate these might have been. On another level, it legitimized torture, made it respectable, allowed educated men to participate in and oversee torture while maintaining their sense of themselves as just and lawful. The judges and magistrates who ordered torture were not, for the most part, sadists or monsters. They were men acting within the legal and cultural framework of their time, men who believed they were serving justice and protecting society. They would have been shocked at the suggestion that what they were doing was wrong or cruel. They were following the law, applying procedures that had been developed by the finest legal minds of the age. This is, perhaps, one of the most disturbing aspects of medieval torture, not that it was carried out by monsters, but that it was carried out by ordinary men who believed they were doing right. The legal framework provided them with the justification they needed, the sense that their actions were not arbitrary cruelty, but measured justice. The victims of this system had few avenues for appeal or relief. There was no presumption of innocence to protect them, no right to legal counsel to advise them, no higher court to which they could easily appeal. They were caught in a system that presumed that torture was a legitimate tool of justice, and that extraction of truth through pain was both legally permissible and morally acceptable. Some legal scholars of the period did question the use of torture. They pointed out the obvious, that torture was as likely to produce false confessions as true ones, that people would say anything to make the pain stop, that innocent people could be convicted while the guilty might have the fortitude to resist. But these voices were few and were not heeded. The system was too entrenched, too useful to authorities, too supported by legal precedent and scholarly opinion. It would not be until the Enlightenment of the 18th century that torture began to be seriously questioned and eventually abolished in most of Europe. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria in his treatise on crimes and punishments 1764 and Voltaire in his campaigning against judicial torture would help change public opinion and legal practice. But in the medieval period and the early modern period that followed, torture was law. It was regulated, documented, justified, and routinely applied. Thousands upon thousands of people passed through the torture chambers of Europe, and the legal framework that allowed this would have seemed, to those who created and maintained it, not barbaric, but civilized, a rational response to the problem of crime and the need for justice. As we continue our exploration of medieval torture and punishment, we must keep in mind this legal context. The tortures we will discuss were not random acts of cruelty, but part of a system, a framework that stretched from the university lecture halls, where Roman law was studied, to the dungeon chambers, where that law was applied to human flesh. To truly understand medieval torture, we must understand how people of that era thought about pain itself. The medieval attitude toward suffering was complex, shaped by religious belief, medical theory, and social structure in ways that can seem alien to modern sensibilities. In medieval Christian theology, pain and suffering held a central place. Christ himself had suffered on the cross, and that suffering was redemptive, saving humanity from sin. The martyrs of the early church had endured terrible tortures for their faith, and these tortures were commemorated and celebrated. Saints were often depicted in the moments of their torment, and the instruments of their torture became their symbols: Saint Catherine with her wheel, Saint Lawrence with his gridiron, Saint Sebastian with his arrows. This religious framework meant that suffering was not seen as an absolute evil to be avoided at all costs. Rather, it could be meaningful, purifying, even holy. Suffering could be a path to God, a way of sharing in Christ's passion, a means of purging sin and achieving grace. Many medieval people actively sought out suffering through ascetic practices, wearing hair shirts, flagellation, extreme fasting, sleeping on hard surfaces or beds of thorns. This valorization of suffering had significant implications for how torture was viewed. If the righteous could embrace suffering for the love of God, if pain could purify and redeem, then perhaps torture of the guilty was not merely punishment, but potentially a means of salvation. The pain of torture might burn away sin, might bring the criminal to true repentance, might save their soul even as it destroyed their body. There was also a belief that the innocent would be sustained by God through torture, that divine intervention would protect those who were truly blameless. This belief was an extension of the older tradition of trial by ordeal. God would not allow the innocent to suffer, and therefore those who confessed under torture must be guilty. This circular reasoning ignored the obvious reality that anyone, guilty or innocent, will eventually break under sufficient pain. Medieval medicine's understanding of pain was very different from our own. The humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, held that the body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health consisted in the proper balance of these humors, and illness resulted from imbalance. Pain was understood as a symptom of humoral imbalance or blockage. This medical framework meant that pain was often treated with techniques that seemed like torture themselves: bleeding, purging, cauterizing. The application of hot irons to the skin was a standard medical treatment for certain conditions. Amputation was performed without anesthesia except for alcohol or opium, when these were available. Surgery was agonizing, and patients had to be held down by strong men while the surgeon worked. In other words, extreme pain was a familiar part of medical treatment, something that people might endure multiple times in their lives. This familiarity with necessary medical pain may have made judicial torture seem less exceptional, less horrifying than it does to us. If pain was an acceptable part of healing, why should it not also be an acceptable part of justice? Social attitudes toward violence and suffering were also shaped by the realities of medieval life. This was a violent age, violent in its sports and entertainments, violent in its punishments, violent in its wars. Public executions were attended by crowds who treated them as entertainment. Animal baiting, setting dogs to attack bears or bulls, was popular amusement. Judicial combats, where disputes were settled by fighting, sometimes to the death, were both legal procedure and public spectacle. Children were raised with corporal punishment that would today be considered abusive. Servants and apprentices could be beaten by their masters. Wives could be beaten by their husbands within certain limits. Violence was woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that made extraordinary violence, like torture and execution, part of a continuum rather than a sharp break from normality. The concept of empathy, as we understand it, the ability to imagine oneself in another's place, and to feel their suffering, existed in the medieval period, but it was more limited in its application. Empathy extended to those within one's own group, family, community, social class, but was much more restricted toward outsiders. A noble might feel great empathy for another noble, but very little for a peasant. A Christian might empathize with fellow Christians, but not with Jews or Muslims. This limited empathy meant that the suffering of criminals, heretics, and other marginalized people could be viewed with a certain detachment. They were other, outside the circle of moral concern, and their suffering, while perhaps regrettable, was necessary and just. Their pain was not one's pain, their screams not the screams of someone with whom one could fully identify. There was also a strong element of what we might call magical thinking in medieval attitudes toward torture and punishment. The body of the criminal was believed to carry the pollution of their crime, and torture could be seen as a way of cleansing that pollution. The breaking of the body mirrored and enacted the breaking of the social bond that the criminal had violated. Public torture and execution served an almost ritual function, repairing the social fabric that crime had torn. The community gathered to witness the criminal's suffering, and in that witnessing, order was restored, justice was seen to be done, and the proper hierarchy of society was reaffirmed. It was, in a sense, a communal act, a shared experience that bound the community together through the exclusion and punishment of the transgressor. Yet we must be careful not to paint too simple a picture. Not everyone in the medieval period was equally comfortable with torture and brutal punishment. There were voices of dissent, expressions of mercy and compassion, moments when individuals recoiled from the suffering they witnessed. There are records of executioners who were tormented by their work, who turned to drink, or went mad from the burden of what they did. There are accounts of crowds who were moved to pity rather than satisfaction by the suffering of the condemned, who begged for mercy, who rioted when punishment seemed too severe. There are stories of judges who sought to avoid ordering torture, who looked for legal ways to achieve justice without brutality. The Church, for all its theological acceptance of suffering, also preached mercy and forgiveness. The lives of saints included many stories of miracles performed to save the innocent from unjust punishment, of divine intervention to comfort those who suffered. The practice of sanctuary, where criminals could find refuge in churches and be immune from arrest, reflected a belief that mercy should temper justice. Medieval literature reveals a complex attitude toward suffering. The courtly romances celebrated knights who endured hardships and pain for honor and love. The tales of martyrs glorified those who suffered for faith. But there were also stories that depicted suffering as tragic, that mourned the cruelty of fate and the harshness of justice, that expressed sympathy for the afflicted. The cult of Mary, the mother of Jesus, became increasingly important in the medieval period, and Mary was often depicted as an intercessor, pleading for mercy for sinful humanity. The image of the Pieta Mary holding the dead body of Christ was a powerful representation of maternal grief over suffering. This suggests that while suffering might be theologically meaningful, it was also emotionally painful, something that could evoke compassion and sorrow. Children's attitudes toward pain and suffering were shaped from a young age by the stories they heard, the punishments they received, and the world they observed. They would have seen animals slaughtered, would have witnessed public punishments, would have been taught that pain was sometimes necessary and just, but they would also have experienced the comfort of being consoled when hurt, would have learned that cruelty for its own sake was wrong, would have developed the normal human capacity for sympathy. The result was a population that could witness torture and execution, without the horror we might feel, but also without taking pleasure in it for the most part. It was accepted as necessary, as part of how the world worked, as what must be done to maintain order and achieve justice. It was, in short, normalized. This normalization is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the culture of pain in the medieval period. Torture was not exceptional, it was ordinary. It was not hidden, it was public. It was not questioned, it was assumed. The apparatus of torture, the techniques, the legal justifications, all existed within a cultural matrix that made them comprehensible and acceptable. Yet even within this context, there were limits. Torture that went beyond what was legally permitted, that was carried out for private revenge rather than public justice, that was excessively cruel even by the standards of the time. These could provoke outrage. There was a line, however fuzzy, between legitimate judicial torture and illegitimate cruelty, and crossing that line could result in consequences for the perpetrator. The point is not that medieval people were cruel or callous in some essential way that we are not. Rather, they lived in a different cultural and legal framework that shaped their perceptions and judgments. What seemed normal and necessary to them seems barbaric to us. What seems barbaric to them, and they did find certain practices barbaric, particularly those of cultures they considered savage, might not seem so terrible to us. As we move forward to discuss the specific methods of torture used in the medieval period, we carry with us this understanding of the cultural context. These were not the practices of monsters, but of humans living in a particular time and place, shaped by particular beliefs and pressures. This does not excuse the cruelty, but it helps us understand it, and in understanding, perhaps we can better appreciate the progress we have made and the vigilance required to prevent regression. The medieval culture of pain, with its complex interweaving of religious belief, medical theory, social practice, and legal framework, created conditions in which torture could flourish. It provided the justifications, the procedures, the audiences, and the executioners. It took the universal human capacity for cruelty and channeled it into systematic, legally sanctioned, publicly performed brutality. And it is to the specifics of that brutality, to the devices and methods that constituted medieval torture, that we now turn our attention. But we do so with understanding, not approval, but understanding of the minds that created these methods and the culture that allowed them. Now we come to perhaps the most visceral aspect of our exploration, the actual instruments of torture used in medieval dungeons and torture chambers across Europe. Before we proceed, let me remind you that our purpose is educational, not sensational. We will discuss these devices with clinical accuracy, but always with respect for the suffering they caused. Let us begin with one of the most iconic instruments of medieval torture, the rack. The rack was perhaps the most widespread and enduring torture device in medieval and early modern Europe. Its basic design was simple: a wooden frame, usually rectangular, with rollers at either end. The victim would be laid on the frame, and their wrists and ankles would be attached to the rollers by ropes. The torturer would then turn the rollers, stretching the victim's body. The simplicity of the rack's design belied its terrible effectiveness. As the rollers turned and the ropes tightened, the victim's body would be gradually stretched. At first, there would be pain in the joints, shoulders, hips, knees, elbows as ligaments were pulled taut. The victim would feel the urge to confess before the pain became unbearable. If the torturer continued, the pain would intensify dramatically. Ligaments would begin to tear, joints would dislocate, and the victim would feel as if they were being pulled apart. The sounds of popping joints and tearing tissue would fill the chamber, along with the screams of the victim. Eventually, if the torture continued long enough, the limbs might actually be pulled from their sockets entirely, or the spine might be damaged. The rack was particularly insidious because it allowed for very precise calibration of pain. The torturer could turn the rollers slowly, giving the victim time to consider confessing at each stage, or the torture could be stopped and resumed, with the victim's terror mounting each time the rollers began to turn again. There were variations on the basic rack design. Some racks were vertical rather than horizontal, with the victim stretched standing up. Some had additional features: spikes or blades on the surface that would press into the victim's back as they were stretched. Some were combined with other tortures, such as having the stretched victim beaten or burned. The rack required a skilled operator. Too much force too quickly could kill the victim or render them unconscious, ending the torture session prematurely. The goal was to inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious and able to speak. This required judgment and experience, and professional torturers who specialized in operating the rack were valued for their expertise. Confessions obtained on the rack were legally questionable even by medieval standards, because of the requirement that confessions be repeated freely after torture. A victim whose joints had been dislocated or whose ligaments had been torn might not be physically capable of standing in court to confirm their confession. Some jurisdictions developed the practice of having the confession repeated immediately after torture, while the victim was still in the torture chamber, to get around this problem. The strappado, also known as the reverse hanging, was another common torture method. The victim's hands would be tied behind their back, and they would be suspended by a rope attached to these bindings. The victim's own body weight would pull their shoulders backward and upward, causing intense pain in the shoulder joints. In its simplest form, the victim would simply be left hanging for extended periods. But there were more severe variations. In one, weights would be attached to the victim's feet, increasing the strain on the shoulders. In another, the victim would be raised high and then suddenly dropped, stopping short of the ground. This jerking motion would cause even more severe damage to the joints and spine. The strappado was particularly popular because it required minimal equipment, just a rope and a pulley or beam. It could be administered almost anywhere, didn't require the elaborate apparatus of something like the rack, and yet was excruciatingly painful. Like the rack, the strappado could be calibrated. The victim could be raised and lowered multiple times, could be left hanging for different durations, could have varying amounts of weight added. The torturer could stop the process at any point to ask questions or give the victim an opportunity to confess. Victims of the strappado often suffered permanent damage to their shoulders and arms. Dislocated shoulders were common, as were torn ligaments and muscles. Some victims lost the use of their arms entirely. The pain was so intense that many people confessed to crimes they had not committed simply to make it stop. The breaking wheel was both a torture device and an execution method. In its torture application, the victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel and beaten with clubs or metal bars, often following a specific pattern intended to break bones in a particular sequence: first the hands and arms, then the feet and legs, then the torso. The wheel could also be used as a device for slow execution. After the victim's limbs had been broken, they might be woven through the spokes of the wheel, and then the wheel would be mounted on a pole and displayed publicly. The victim, immobilized by their broken bones, would die slowly from exposure, shock, and infection, sometimes taking days to finally expire. The breaking wheel was particularly horrific because of the slow, methodical nature of the torture. Each blow was carefully placed, each bone deliberately broken. The victim would watch as the torturer moved from one limb to the next, knowing what was coming but unable to prevent it. In some regions, the breaking wheel was reserved for particularly heinous crimes or for repeat offenders. The public nature of the punishment, first the torture, then the display of the broken body, was meant to serve as a powerful deterrent. Crowds would gather to watch, and the screams of the victim would echo through the town square. These were devices of deceptive simplicity. Thumbscrews consisted of a small clamp that would be tightened around the victim's thumb or fingers, slowly crushing them. Leg screws worked on the same principle but were larger, designed to crush the victim's legs. The pain from these devices was intense but localized, which had certain advantages from the torturer's perspective. The victim remained conscious and able to speak, which was essential if the goal was to extract a confession. The torture could continue for extended periods, without the victim passing out from pain. Thumbscrews were particularly popular for interrogation because they were portable and easy to use. A torturer could carry a set of thumbscrews in a small bag and apply them quickly when needed. They left relatively little visible damage compared to something like the rack, which might make it easier to present the victim in court later. The psychological impact of thumbscrews should not be underestimated. Watching your own fingers being slowly crushed, feeling the bones crack and the flesh pulp, knowing that you could stop it by confessing to whatever was asked, this created enormous pressure to give in. The boot, also known as the Spanish boot or brodequins, was a device used to crush the leg and foot. Metal or wooden wedges would be hammered between the boards of the boot and the victim's leg, gradually crushing the flesh and bone. Different versions of the boot existed. Some were designed to crush the entire leg, some focused on the foot, some on the ankle. All were excruciatingly painful. The crushing of bone and flesh, the inability to see what was being done as the boot covered the affected area, the sound of the wedges being hammered in all combined to create a torture experience that broke many victims. The boot could cause permanent crippling. Even if the bones eventually healed, victims were often left unable to walk properly. This long-term consequence didn't trouble medieval authorities. A crippled criminal was still a criminal who had confessed, and the visible evidence of their torture might even serve as an additional deterrent to others. The pear, or pear of anguish, was a particularly cruel device. It consisted of a metal device shaped roughly like a pear, with segments that could be expanded by turning a screw. This device would be inserted into a bodily orifice, the mouth, anus, or vagina, and then slowly expanded, causing terrible internal damage. The pear was used for different crimes, depending on where it was inserted. Oral insertion was supposedly for liars and blasphemers, anal insertion for homosexuals, and vaginal insertion for women accused of sexual crimes or adultery. However, the historical evidence for the widespread use of this device is actually quite limited, and some historians believe it may be more myth than reality, or that it was used far less commonly than popular imagination suggests. The application of hot metal to flesh was one of the oldest and most common forms of torture. It required minimal equipment, a source of heat, and a piece of metal, and was effective at causing intense pain. Branding irons could be used in several ways. They might be used to mark criminals permanently, so that everyone who saw them would know they had been convicted of a crime. They might be applied to various parts of the body during interrogation, with the threat of continued burning encouraging confession. They might be used as a form of punishment in themselves, particularly for first-time offenders or minor crimes. The pain of being burned is immediate and intense. Flesh sizzles and blackens, the smell is unmistakable, and the agony is so severe that many victims would immediately confess to anything to prevent the iron from being applied again. Fire was also used in other ways. Victims might have their feet held over hot coals, or might be forced to sit or stand on heated metal surfaces. Candles or torches might be held close to sensitive areas of the body. All of these methods caused terrible pain and often left permanent scarring. I notice we're reaching a natural transition point in discussing torture devices. Let me continue with the remaining instruments, and then move into the next sections. Water was used in several different torture methods. In one variation, the victim would be tied down and forced to swallow large amounts of water, sometimes with a cloth stuffed into their mouth that would be saturated with water, forcing them to swallow or suffocate. The victim's stomach would swell grotesquely, causing intense pain and difficulty breathing. In another variation, water would be dripped slowly onto the victim's forehead, always in the same spot. This sounds innocuous, but the psychological effect was profound. The constant drip, 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 never stopping, never varying, would drive victims to madness. They couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but that next drop hitting their forehead. Some victims would confess simply to make the dripping stop. Water torture had the advantage, from the torturer's perspective, of leaving no marks. There was no scarring, no broken bones, nothing that would be visible when the victim stood trial. This made it easier to maintain the legal fiction that the confession had been given freely. Some tortures involved the use of animals. Rats were particularly common. The victim might be tied down and rats would be placed in a cage or box on their stomach. The cage would then be heated, and the rats, desperate to escape the heat, would burrow through the victim's flesh. This was not merely painful, but also deeply psychologically traumatic. The sensation of animals eating through your living flesh, the inability to stop them, the knowledge that you were being consumed alive, this could break even strong-willed individuals. Other animals were used as well. Dogs might be set to attack bound victims. Insects could be used being covered with honey and left for insects to feast on, or having insects placed in bodily orifices. These methods had the dual effect of causing pain and humiliation. This device was allegedly used specifically for women, particularly those convicted of adultery, abortion, or other sexual crimes. It consisted of metal claws that would be heated and then used to tear at the victim's breasts. However, like the pair, the historical evidence for the widespread use of this device is questionable. It may have existed and been used in some times and places, but it was likely far less common than sensationalist accounts suggest. The very specificity of the device and its gendered nature have made it a focus of later imagination and exaggeration. The Judas cradle, also called the Judas chair, was a pyramid-shaped seat. The victim would be suspended above the point of the pyramid and then gradually lowered onto it. The point would enter the anus or vagina, causing terrible pain and injury. The torture could be prolonged by raising and lowering the victim, by rocking them, or by adding weights. The combination of pain, humiliation, and the certainty of continued suffering made this an effective method for extracting confessions. Like many torture devices, the Judas cradle's actual historical use is difficult to verify. We have descriptions of it from various sources, but physical evidence is scarce. This may be because such devices were destroyed when torture was abolished, or because they were never as common as later accounts suggest. This device was the opposite of the rack. Instead of stretching the victim, it compressed them. The victim would be forced into a crouched position and metal bands would be tightened around them, compressing their body into an ever smaller space. This compression caused different but equally severe pain compared to stretching. Blood vessels would rupture, ribs might crack, internal organs would be compressed. The victim might vomit blood or lose consciousness from the pressure. The scavenger's daughter was reportedly invented in England during the reign of Henry VIII, making it a later addition to the torture arsenal than many of the devices we've discussed. Its use was limited primarily to the Tower of London and a few other locations. The Iron Maiden is perhaps the most famous torture device in popular imagination, depicted in countless movies and books. Supposedly, it was an iron cabinet in the shape of a woman, with spikes on the interior. The victim would be placed inside and the door would be closed, driving the spikes into their body. However, historians now largely agree that the Iron Maiden as commonly depicted is a later invention, likely from the 18th or 19th century. There is no solid evidence that such devices were used during the medieval period. The Iron Maidens that exist in museums today were likely created for display purposes, not for actual torture. This is an important reminder that not everything that appears in accounts of medieval torture is historically accurate. Over time, myths and exaggerations have blended with historical reality, and separating fact from fiction can be challenging. This was a simple but effective device, a two-pronged fork that would be placed with one end under the chin and the other end pressing against the chest, held in place by a strap around the neck. The victim could not lower their head without the fork stabbing into their flesh, and they could not raise it without exhausting themselves. Sleep became impossible, as any relaxation would cause the fork to press deeper. Speech was difficult, as moving the jaw would push against the fork. The victim would be kept in this position for hours or days, becoming increasingly exhausted and desperate. Some heretics' forks had the word abiuro, I recant, engraved on them, making the device's purpose explicit. It was to force heretics to recant their beliefs. The religious motivations behind some torture methods were often overt in this way. These were large metal shears, often heated, that would be used to tear flesh from the body. They might be used on various parts of the body, but were supposedly sometimes specifically targeted at men accused of attempting to assassinate the king, representing an attack on the very manhood that had given them the audacity to threaten their sovereign. Again, the historical evidence for the widespread use of this specific device is limited. We have some accounts and descriptions, but determining how common it actually was is difficult. Looking across all these devices, we can identify some common features. Most were designed to be adjustable, to allow the torturer to calibrate the level of pain inflicted. This adjustability was important for the legal fiction that torture was carefully controlled and proportionate. Many devices were designed to be used over extended periods. Quick torture that led to unconsciousness or death was useless for extracting confessions. The most effective devices could maintain high levels of pain for hours or days while keeping the victim conscious and able to speak. Visibility was often a factor. Many tortures were designed so that the victim could see what was being done to them, or so that they would have to watch as the torturer prepared the next phase of torture. This psychological element enhanced the physical pain. Most devices required skill to operate effectively. A torturer had to know how much pressure to apply, when to stop, when to continue, how to read the victim's responses. This requirement for skill meant that torture became a profession, with techniques passed down and refined over time. It's important to note that while we have descriptions and sometimes physical examples of these torture devices, determining exactly how common they were and how frequently they were used is challenging. Records of torture sessions exist, but they often don't specify which devices were used, only noting that torture was applied. Some devices may have been used primarily for their psychological impact, the threat of the device, rather than its actual application. The sight of the rack or the boot might be enough to break some prisoners without the torture actually being carried out. Other tortures were simpler than the exotic devices we've discussed. Beating, whipping, burning with simple hot irons, application of thumbscrews. These required no special equipment and were probably far more common than use of elaborate devices like the rack or the wheel. The popular imagination has latched onto the most dramatic and exotic torture methods, and over time, these have become synonymous with medieval torture in general. But the reality was likely more mundane, and in some ways more terrible. Not exotic devices used by specialists, but simple, brutal methods used routinely by ordinary officials carrying out what they saw as their duty. As we reach the end of this section on torture devices, let us pause for a moment of reflection. Behind each device we've discussed were real people who suffered. These were not abstract concepts or historical curiosities, they were instruments of human agony, used on individuals who felt pain as acutely as you or I do. Some of those individuals were undoubtedly guilty of real crimes. Others were innocent, caught up in power struggles, religious conflicts, or simply the victim of false accusations. The torture devices made no distinction, they caused suffering regardless of guilt or innocence. And those who operated these devices, who turned the screws and cranked the wheels and hammered the wedges, they were human too. Some may have taken pleasure in their work, but most were probably ordinary people carrying out orders, earning a living, doing what society told them was necessary and just. This is the dark heart of torture, not that monsters did monstrous things, but that ordinary humans created systems that transformed cruelty into procedure, suffering into law, agony into daily routine. And here, dear listener, we pause our journey. We have descended into the dungeons, understood the legal frameworks, grasped the cultural context, and examined the instruments of torture themselves. The night is deep, and you have traveled far through these dark histories. Let your mind now rest from these heavy thoughts. Tomorrow's light will come, as it always does, and these shadows of the past will retreat before it. For now, let sleep embrace you, and let these stories settle into their proper place, not forgotten. For the past must be remembered, but neither all-consuming, for the present demands our attention and our hope. Sleep well, traveler through time. The dungeons of the past are closed to us now, and we wake in a world that, for all its flaws, has left much of this darkness behind. Now we must examine how torture was actually conducted, the procedures, the rituals, the step-by-step progression from accusation to confession. This was not random brutality, but a carefully orchestrated process, governed by rules and customs that varied across regions, but shared common elements throughout medieval Europe. The process typically began with an accusation. This might come from a victim of crime, from witnesses, from rumor and gossip, or from the authorities themselves investigating suspicious behavior. In the inquisitorial system, officials had the power to initiate investigations on their own authority, without waiting for a formal complaint. Once an accusation was made and deemed credible, a summons would be issued. The accused would be ordered to appear before the magistrate or judge to answer questions. Failure to appear would be taken as evidence of guilt and could result in arrest and the seizure of property. For those who did appear, the initial questioning would be relatively gentle. The accused would be asked about their whereabouts at relevant times, their relationship to any victims or witnesses, their knowledge of the crime. This questioning would be documented by a scribe, creating an official record. If the initial questioning raised suspicions, or if the evidence against the accused was substantial, they might be placed under arrest and confined to await further proceedings. This confinement, as we discussed earlier, was itself a form of suffering, cold, damp, uncertain, sometimes lasting weeks or months. Before torture could be applied, certain procedures had to be followed. The accused had to be warned that torture was being considered. This warning served multiple purposes. It gave the accused a final chance to confess voluntarily. It demonstrated that the authorities were following proper procedure, and it often broke weaker prisoners who would confess at the mere threat of torture. The warning would be delivered formally, often in the presence of officials who would witness and document it. The accused would be told what evidence existed against them, what they were suspected of, and what would happen if they did not confess. The instruments of torture might be shown to them, explained in detail, their effects described. Many confessions were obtained at this stage. The psychological pressure of knowing that torture was imminent, combined with the physical and mental exhaustion of imprisonment, was often enough to break resistance. Those who confessed at this point would be spared the torture itself, though they still faced trial and punishment for their confessed crimes. For those who maintained their innocence despite the warning, the next step was being brought to the torture chamber. This journey itself was part of the psychological torture. The prisoner would be led through corridors downstairs, perhaps passing other prisoners or hearing their screams. The anticipation built with each step. The torture chamber was designed to inspire fear. It was typically underground, lit by torches or candles that cast flickering shadows. The instruments of torture would be visible: the rack, the wheel, the various implements hanging on walls or sitting ready for use. The air would smell of smoke, sweat, blood, and fear. Officials would be present: the judge or magistrate authorizing the torture, the scribe to record everything that happened, guards to control the prisoner, and the torturer himself. This was not a private affair, but an official proceeding, conducted with witnesses and documentation. The prisoner would be stripped, either partially or completely. This served practical purposes. Clothing could interfere with the torture devices, but it was also psychologically devastating. the vulnerability of nakedness, the humiliation of being exposed before strangers, the loss of the last shred of dignity, all of this weakened resistance before the torture even began. Women prisoners faced particular humiliation, as they would be stripped and examined by men. The fear of sexual assault was ever present, even if the official torture did not include rape. Some female prisoners were indeed sexually assaulted, either as part of the torture or by guards and officials who took advantage of their powerlessness. Once stripped, the prisoner would be positioned for torture. If the rack was to be used, they would be laid upon it and their wrists and ankles bound to the rollers. If the strappado, their hands would be tied behind their back and attached to the rope. Each device required specific positioning, and the prisoner would feel their body being arranged for maximum suffering. The psychological impact of this positioning cannot be overstated. The prisoner was now completely helpless, unable to move, unable to protect themselves, entirely at the mercy of their torturers. The loss of control was absolute and terrifying. With the prisoner positioned and the officials assembled, the formal interrogation would begin. The judge would ask questions, and the scribe would record both questions and answers. The questions would be specific, not open-ended inquiries, but focused demands for particular information. Did you commit this crime? Where were you on this date? Who were your accomplices? What did you do with the stolen goods? If the prisoner answered satisfactorily, admitting guilt and providing details, the torture might not proceed or might be limited. But if they maintained their innocence or refused to provide the desired information, the torture would begin. The initial application of torture was typically mild: a few turns of the rack's rollers, brief suspension in the strappado, light pressure from the thumb screws. This was the first degree of torture, meant to encourage confession without causing severe injury. After each application of pain, the questioning would resume. The prisoner would be given the chance to confess, to provide information, to end their suffering. The pattern would repeat: question, denial, torture, question, denial, torture, in a rhythm that could continue for hours. If the first degree of torture failed to produce a confession, the authorities could authorize escalation to the second degree, then potentially to the third. Each degree involved more intense pain, longer duration, or the addition of other torments. On the rack, escalation might mean more turns of the rollers, stretching the body further. Weights might be added to increase the strain. The duration of stretching would be extended. Each escalation would be documented: how many turns, for how long, what the prisoner said or screamed. With the strappado, escalation could mean adding heavier weights to the feet, dropping the prisoner from greater heights, leaving them suspended for longer periods. Each increase in severity brought increased likelihood of permanent injury, but also increased likelihood of confession. The torturer had to exercise judgment throughout this process. The goal was to extract a confession, not to kill or permanently disable the prisoner, though this certainly happened. A skilled torturer could read the prisoner's responses, could sense when they were near breaking, could calibrate the pain to maximize pressure while minimizing the risk of death or unconsciousness. Eventually, most prisoners broke. The pain, the fear, the hopelessness of their situation would overcome whatever resistance they had. They would confess to the crimes they were accused of, and often to additional crimes they had not been asked about, desperate to make the pain stop. The moment of confession was crucial and would be carefully documented. The exact words spoken, the time, the circumstances, all would be recorded by the scribe. The confession might be quite detailed, with the prisoner providing names, dates, locations, and descriptions of their crimes. But there was a legal problem. A confession given under torture was not, technically, valid. The prisoner had to confirm their confession freely, without torture or the threat of torture, before it could be used to convict them. This requirement was meant to ensure that confessions were genuine, not merely the product of unbearable pain. In practice, this safeguard was largely meaningless. The prisoner would be removed from the torture chamber, perhaps given some time to recover, and then brought before the judge to confirm their confession. They would be warned that if they recanted, they could be tortured again. Under these circumstances, virtually all prisoners confirmed their confessions. Some prisoners did recant, insisting that their confession had been false, forced from them by pain they could not endure. These cases presented a dilemma for the authorities. On one hand, the legal requirement for free confirmation had not been met. On the other hand, the authorities had invested considerable time and effort in extracting the confession and were convinced of the prisoner's guilt. The usual solution was to torture the prisoner again. If they confessed again and confirmed the confession again, that might be accepted as sufficient. But there were supposed to be limits on how many times a person could be tortured for the same accusation. These limits were often ignored or circumvented through legal fictions, such as claiming that each session was merely a continuation of the previous one. Not everyone confessed, even under severe torture. Some prisoners maintained their innocence through ordeals that should have broken anyone. These cases troubled the authorities and the legal system. From one perspective, resistance to torture could be seen as evidence of innocence. God was sustaining the innocent against unjust suffering. This was the theoretical basis for torture as a truth-finding mechanism. But in practice, authorities who were convinced of a prisoner's guilt would interpret resistance to torture as evidence of supernatural assistance from the devil. This was particularly common in witchcraft cases. A woman who could endure torture without confessing might be accused of having been made insensible to pain by demonic power. Her very resistance became additional evidence of her guilt. This circular logic made it nearly impossible to prove innocence through steadfast resistance. Some prisoners died under torture without confessing. This created legal complications. If they died before being convicted, could their property be seized? Could their family be punished? The answers varied by jurisdiction and circumstance, but the death of a prisoner under torture was generally seen as unfortunate rather than as evidence of wrongdoing by the authorities. There are remarkable accounts of individuals who withstood torture that should have killed them. Some were motivated by genuine innocence and the determination not to confess to crimes they had not committed. Others were guilty, but feared that confession would implicate family members or accomplices. Still others were driven by stubborn pride or religious conviction. These stories of resistance, while sometimes celebrated in later accounts, were rare. The vast majority of prisoners eventually confessed to whatever was demanded of them. The torture techniques had been refined over centuries to be maximally effective at breaking human resistance. After the torture session ended, whether with confession or without, the prisoner faced additional suffering. They would be returned to their cell, often severely injured. Dislocated joints, broken bones, torn flesh, burns. These injuries would receive minimal medical attention, if any. Infection was a constant risk. The unsanitary conditions of the dungeon, combined with open wounds from torture, created ideal conditions for disease. Many prisoners who survived the torture itself died later from infected wounds or from diseases contracted in the aftermath. The psychological trauma of torture was profound and lasting. Even those who survived physically often bore mental scars. Nightmares, an inability to speak about what had happened, sudden terror at certain sounds or sights. These were common responses to torture trauma. For those who had confessed, the torture was over, but trial and punishment still awaited. The confession would be used as evidence against them, and conviction was now virtually certain. They would face the scaffold, the gallows, the stake, or whatever form of execution was prescribed for their crime. For those who had not confessed, the uncertainty continued. They might be tortured again, or they might be held in prison while authorities gathered more evidence. Some prisoners spent months or even years in this legal limbo, neither convicted nor acquitted. Certain categories of prisoners received different treatment during torture. Pregnant women, for instance, were theoretically protected from torture until after they gave birth. However, this protection was not absolute in urgent cases, such as accusations of treason or witchcraft. Even pregnancy might not provide safety. Nobles and clergy had certain protections under law. Torture of nobles was supposed to require higher authorization and be conducted with more restraint. Clergy could claim benefit of clergy, transferring their cases to ecclesiastical courts that were sometimes less brutal, but these protections could be overcome when the crime was serious enough or when authorities were sufficiently motivated. Children were generally exempt from severe torture, though they might be frightened or subjected to minor pain to encourage testimony. The age at which someone ceased to be a child varied. It might be as young as 12 or 14 in some jurisdictions. the mentally ill or intellectually disabled presented special challenges. Medieval understanding of mental illness was limited, and someone who was confused or incoherent might be seen as possessed or as feigning madness. There were few protections for such individuals, and they might be tortured despite their incapacity to understand or respond appropriately to interrogation. Throughout the torture process, meticulous records were kept. The scribe would document everything: the date and time, the officials present, the charges against the prisoner, the questions asked, the answers given, the tortures applied, the duration of each torture, the prisoner's responses and statements. These records served multiple purposes. They provided legal documentation that proper procedures had been followed. They created a permanent record of the confession that could be used at trial. They protected the authorities against accusations of improper conduct, and they satisfied the bureaucratic impulse to document and categorize that characterized medieval administration. Reading these torture records today is a disturbing experience. The clinical, matter-of-fact language describing terrible suffering creates a cognitive dissonance. The prisoner was placed upon the rack and stretched for the duration of 1/4 hour. Upon being questioned, the prisoner denied the charges. The stretching was continued for an additional 1/4 hour, with 2 full turns of the wheels. The prisoner then confessed to the crime of theft. The routine nature of these descriptions, the bureaucratic tone, the careful notation of time and method, all of this speaks to how normalized torture had become. It was simply a procedure, no different in spirit from any other legal process, to be documented with the same careful attention to detail. We must pause here to consider those who actually inflicted the torture, the torturers themselves. Who were these people, and how did they come to this profession? In most jurisdictions, the position of torturer or executioner was a formal office, sometimes hereditary, sometimes appointed. It was not a prestigious position. Torturers were generally regarded with a mixture of fear and contempt, but it was necessary, and it could be reasonably lucrative. Torturers were paid for their work, either by salary or by fee per torture. They might receive additional payments from prisoners or their families' payments to reduce the severity of torture, to provide better treatment in the dungeon, or to ensure a quick death if execution was the sentence. The social status of torturers was complicated. They were necessary to the functioning of justice, but they were also tainted by their contact with blood and death. They often lived apart from others, and their children might be barred from certain trades or marriages. This social isolation could become a self-perpetuating cycle, with the children of torturers becoming torturers themselves because no other options were available. Some torturers approached their work with professional detachment, seeing themselves as craftsmen performing a necessary service. They took pride in their skill, in knowing exactly how much pain to inflict, in being able to extract confessions efficiently. They might view themselves as servants of justice, helping to maintain order and punish the guilty. Others were troubled by their work. Historical records include accounts of torturers who drank heavily, who suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, who sought forgiveness from priests, who on their deathbeds expressed remorse for what they had done. The psychological burden of inflicting suffering day after day, year after year, must have been profound. And undoubtedly, some torturers enjoyed their work. The power to cause pain, the control over another human being's suffering, the license to inflict cruelty without punishment, these could attract individuals with sadistic tendencies. Such individuals would have been drawn to the profession and might have excelled at it, precisely because they found satisfaction in what they did. Training for torturers was often informal, with knowledge passed from one generation to the next, or from master to apprentice. The techniques of torture, the operation of various devices, the ability to read a prisoner's condition, all of this required learning and practice. Some cities and states developed more formal training programs, recognizing that skilled torturers were valuable assets. The torturer's tools were his responsibility to maintain. Racks had to be kept in working order, ropes had to be strong and secure, metal implements had to be cleaned and sometimes sharpened. This maintenance was part of the professional duty, ensuring that when torture was ordered, it could be carried out effectively. The process of torture varied significantly across different regions of Europe. In some areas, torture was tightly controlled and rarely used. In others, it was employed frequently and with fewer restrictions. The Italian city-states, with their revival of Roman law, developed sophisticated legal codes governing torture. These codes specified in great detail when torture could be used, what procedures must be followed, what protections existed for different categories of prisoners. In practice, these protections were often inadequate, but they did provide some limits. In the Holy Roman Empire, the Carolina Code of 1532 attempted to standardize torture practices across the diverse territories of the empire. It included provisions about evidence, procedure, and the types of torture that were permissible. This code remained influential for centuries and shaped torture practices in German-speaking lands. France developed its own distinctive approach, with royal ordinances regulating torture and execution. The French system distinguished between different types of torture and different purposes for which it could be used. French torture practices were among the most systematized and bureaucratic in Europe. In Spain, the Inquisition developed its own procedures for interrogation and torture. Contrary to popular myth, the Spanish Inquisition was actually relatively restrained in its use of torture compared to secular courts. It kept detailed records, limited the duration and severity of torture, and had lower rates of execution than many other jurisdictions. This is not to excuse the Inquisition's practices, but to provide historical context and accuracy. England was something of an exception in European torture practices. English common law generally prohibited torture, and it was not part of standard legal procedure as it was on the continent. However, this prohibition was not absolute. Torture could be authorized by the monarch or Privy Council in cases involving treason or matters of state security. The Tower of London and other royal facilities had torture chambers, and they were used, particularly during periods of political upheaval. Scotland had different legal traditions than England, and did permit torture as part of judicial procedure. Scottish torture practices were similar to those on the continent, with various devices and methods being employed to extract confessions. In Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, torture was also practiced, though the specific methods and legal frameworks differed. The universality of judicial torture across diverse cultures and legal systems speaks to something troubling about human nature and the exercise of power. A question that troubled some medieval legal thinkers, and that troubles us today, is whether torture actually worked as a tool for finding truth. Did it produce genuine confessions, or merely false admissions made to stop the pain? The historical evidence is mixed. Certainly, torture produced many confessions. Prisoners confessed to crimes and provided details that could be verified. In some cases, stolen goods were recovered based on information obtained through torture, or accomplices were identified and arrested. However, torture also produced false confessions. Innocent people confessed to crimes they had not committed. Prisoners implicated others falsely, either to shift blame, or because they named whoever came to mind under the pressure of torture. Details of confessions were sometimes impossible or inconsistent, revealing that the confession had been fabricated. The problem was recognized even in the medieval period. Legal scholars noted that torture could lead the guilty to confess, but could also force the innocent to lie. Some recommended that confessions obtained through torture be carefully verified against other evidence. But these concerns did not lead to the abandonment of torture, only to attempts to refine its use. Part of the difficulty was the self-reinforcing nature of the system. Authorities who believed someone was guilty would torture them to obtain a confession. When a confession was obtained, it confirmed the authorities' initial belief and validated the use of torture. The circular logic was hard to break. Moreover, from the perspective of the authorities, even false confessions might serve a purpose. A conviction and punishment, even of an innocent person, demonstrated that justice was being done, maintained order, and deterred others from crime. The individual truth of any particular case might be less important than the broader social function of punishment. Some prisoners developed strategies to resist torture or to minimize their suffering. These strategies were rarely successful, The torture apparatus was designed to overcome resistance, but they reveal the human capacity for agency, even in the most desperate circumstances. One strategy was to confess to a lesser crime. If tortured for murder, a prisoner might confess to manslaughter or accidental killing. This might result in a lighter sentence while ending the torture. Authorities might accept such a confession, particularly if they were unsure of their case or if the lesser crime was still serious enough to warrant punishment. Another strategy was to provide a partial confession, admitting to some elements of the crime while denying others. This could sometimes satisfy interrogators enough to end the torture session, while potentially leaving room for argument at trial. Some prisoners tried to feign unconsciousness or madness, hoping to escape further torture. This rarely worked, as torturers were experienced in distinguishing real from feigned incapacity. Cold water thrown in the face or sharp pain applied to sensitive areas would quickly reveal malingering. A few prisoners attempted to take their own lives rather than endure continued torture. This was difficult, as prisoners were kept under guard and restrained. But there are accounts of prisoners who managed to hang themselves with bedding, to starve themselves, or to inflict fatal injuries on themselves. Suicide was considered a grave sin and a crime, and the bodies of suicides might be subjected to additional punishment. But for some, escape through death seemed preferable to continued suffering. Perhaps the most effective resistance strategy, though also the rarest, was to have powerful advocates outside the prison. A prisoner whose family or associates could bring pressure on the authorities, who could hire lawyers to argue legal technicalities, who could bribe officials. Such a prisoner might escape torture or have it ended early. But this option was available only to a privileged few. For the vast majority of prisoners, there was no escape and no effective resistance. They were caught in a system designed to break them, and break them it did. The process of torture, with its careful procedures and legal formalities, its escalating pain and psychological pressure, its documentation and official oversight, was remarkably effective at producing confessions, whether true or false. As we complete this examination of the interrogation process, we see how torture was not mere brutality, but a rational, organized, legally sanctioned system for extracting confessions through pain. This systematization, this transformation of cruelty into procedure, may be more disturbing than random violence would have been. It reveals how human ingenuity can be turned toward dark purposes, how legal structures can legitimize suffering, and how ordinary people can participate in terrible acts while maintaining their sense of themselves as just and righteous. Among all the applications of medieval and early modern torture, none have captured the popular imagination quite like the witch trials and the Inquisition. These deserve special attention, not because they were necessarily more brutal than other applications of torture, though they could be, but because they reveal particular aspects of how religious belief, social anxiety, and judicial torture could combine with devastating effect. The Great European witch hunts occurred primarily in the period from roughly 1450 to 1750, extending well beyond the medieval period proper into the early modern era. However, the foundations were laid in medieval thought, making this an essential part of our examination. Medieval Christianity had always acknowledged the existence of witchcraft and magic, but for much of the medieval period, the official church position was relatively skeptical. The Canon Episcopi, a 10th century text, suggested that beliefs in witches flying through the night were superstitious delusions, not reality. Practicing magic might be a sin and a crime, but it was not seen as an organized conspiracy of devil worshippers threatening Christian civilization. This began to change in the 14th and 15th centuries. Several factors contributed to the shift. The Black Death had killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population, creating social disruption and a desperate search for explanations and scapegoats. The end of the medieval warm period brought climate changes that resulted in failed harvests and famine. The Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation created religious anxiety and competition. Wars, economic upheaval, and social change contributed to a sense that the world was becoming dangerous and uncontrollable. Into this atmosphere of anxiety came new theological ideas about witchcraft. Rather than being isolated individuals practicing folk magic, witches came to be seen as part of a vast conspiracy. They were believed to have made pacts with the devil, renouncing Christianity and receiving demonic powers in exchange. They were thought to gather in secret nocturnal meetings called Sabbaths, where they worshipped Satan, engaged in orgies, and plotted the destruction of Christian society. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches in 1486, was a crucial moment. Written by Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor, this text provided a comprehensive guide to identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting witches. It combined theology, legal procedure, and lurid descriptions of witches' alleged activities. Despite being rejected by many church authorities, the book became extremely influential and went through numerous editions. The Malleus Maleficarum was particularly significant for its views on gender. It argued that women were more susceptible to becoming witches than men, due to their supposedly weaker nature and greater carnality. This gendered conception of witchcraft meant that the majority of witch trial victims, though not all, were women. Estimates suggest that roughly 75–80% of those executed for witchcraft in Europe were female. The process of accusing, investigating, and trying someone for witchcraft followed the general pattern of judicial procedure but had some distinctive features. Accusations of witchcraft could come from various sources. A neighbor might blame a woman for causing illness in their children through magic. Livestock deaths, crop failures, storms, or any unexplained misfortune might be attributed to witchcraft. Sometimes accusations arose from personal feuds or from the desire to seize a wealthy neighbor's property. Once an accusation was made, the authorities would investigate. They would question the accuser, gather testimony from neighbors about the suspect's reputation and behavior, and look for physical evidence of witchcraft. This evidence might include possession of ointments, herbs, or other materials that could be used for magic, or the finding of witches' marks, unusual spots or moles on the body that were believed to be where the witch had been marked by the devil. The search for witches' marks was particularly degrading. The accused would be stripped and their entire body examined for any unusual features. Birthmarks, moles, scars, even hemorrhoids might be identified as witches' marks. These marks would sometimes be pricked with needles if the accused did not bleed or did not feel pain at a particular spot. This was taken as confirmation that it was a demonic mark. The swimming test was another form of investigation. The accused would be bound and thrown into water. It was believed that water, as a pure element used in baptism, would reject a witch. If the accused floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, though they might drown in the process of proving their innocence. This test was not universally used and was actually condemned by many authorities, but it persisted in some areas, particularly in England and Scotland. Once sufficient suspicion had been raised, the accused might be arrested and imprisoned. The conditions of imprisonment for accused witches were often especially harsh. They might be held in complete isolation, denied contact with family or friends, kept in darkness, all to break their spirit before interrogation even began. When it came to interrogation, torture was frequently employed, and in witch trials it was often applied with particular severity. The reasoning was that witches, having made pacts with the devil, would be especially resistant to torture. Their demonic master might sustain them, make them insensible to pain, or give them the strength to resist. Therefore, more extreme torture might be necessary. The questions asked during torture of accused witches followed a pattern. The interrogators wanted to know, had the accused made a pact with the devil? When and how did this pact occur? What powers did the devil grant them? What harm had they caused through their magic? Who were their accomplices in witchcraft? When and where did they attend Sabbaths? What occurred at these Sabbaths? The pressure to name accomplices was particularly intense. Witch hunters believed in the existence of organized witch conspiracies, and they wanted to root out all members. A witch who confessed might be tortured until they provided names of other witches. These newly accused individuals would then be arrested and tortured in turn, creating chains of accusations that could engulf entire communities. The confessions obtained from accused witches under torture were often elaborate and fantastic. Accused women would describe flying through the air to Sabbath meetings, seeing the devil in various forms, participating in rituals that parodied Christian services, engaging in sexual acts with demons, causing storms and crop failures, poisoning neighbors, and killing infants. These confessions followed similar patterns across Europe, suggesting that interrogators were asking leading questions, or that accused witches had heard stories of what they were expected to confess. Some of these confessions included details that seemed to have been drawn from the accused person's imagination or from folklore and popular culture. Others seemed to have been suggestions from the interrogators that the accused simply agreed to. The torture was designed to produce specific types of confessions, and it succeeded in doing so, the intensity of which persecution varied enormously across Europe. Some regions experienced intense witch hunts with hundreds or thousands of trials and executions. Others had relatively few trials. Germany, particularly the numerous small principalities and bishoprics of the Holy Roman Empire, experienced some of the most severe witch hunts. The fragmented nature of political authority meant that local rulers had great autonomy in pursuing witch trials. Some regions, like the Prince-Bishopric of Bamberg or the city of Trier, saw mass trials that claimed hundreds of victims. Scotland had intense witch persecution, particularly in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Scottish law permitted torture, and it was used extensively in witch trials. The swimming test was common in Scotland, as was sleep deprivation, keeping the accused awake for days until they became so exhausted and disoriented that they would confess to anything. Switzerland, despite its later reputation for rationality and calm, experienced severe witch hunts in some cantons. The mountainous terrain and isolated communities may have contributed to suspicions of witchcraft. France had witch trials, but they were somewhat less severe than in Germany or Scotland. French legal procedures, while permitting torture, also had more safeguards and opportunities for appeal. The Parliament of Paris, the Supreme Court, reviewed many witch trial cases and often overturned convictions or reduced sentences. Spain and Italy, despite popular imagination associating these countries with the Inquisition and witch burning, actually had relatively restrained witch persecution. The Spanish Inquisition, in particular, was skeptical of many witch accusations and conducted relatively few witch trials. When trials did occur, the Inquisition applied its standard procedures, which were actually less brutal than those of many secular courts. England had witch trials, but English law prohibited judicial torture, except in extraordinary cases. This meant that confessions could not be routinely extracted through torture. English witch trials relied more on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. The most famous witch trials in the English-speaking world actually occurred in the American colonies, the Salem witch trials of 1692-1693 in Massachusetts. Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and Russia, had witch trials that extended later than in Western Europe. The trials in these regions are less well documented, but could be extremely severe. The Inquisition, or more accurately, the various Inquisitions, played a complex role in witch persecution. There were several different Inquisitions: the Medieval Inquisition, established in the 12th century to combat heresy; the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478; the Portuguese Inquisition, and the Roman Inquisition, reorganized in 1542. These Inquisitions were primarily concerned with heresy, the holding of beliefs contrary to Catholic teaching. This included not only Protestant beliefs after the Reformation but also various other forms of religious deviation: Catholicism in southern France, Judaism among conversos converted Jews, and Islam among Moriscos converted Muslims. Witchcraft could be classified as heresy, since making a pact with the devil was seen as renouncing Christianity. However, the Inquisitions generally took a more skeptical approach to witchcraft accusations than secular courts did. The Spanish Inquisition, in particular, is worth examining in detail, as it has become synonymous with religious persecution in popular culture. The reality of the Spanish Inquisition was more complex than the Black legend suggests. The Spanish Inquisition was established by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1478, with papal approval. Its initial purpose was to investigate and punish conversos Jews who had converted to Christianity, who were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. Later, it extended its reach to other groups, including Moriscos, Protestants, and those accused of various moral and religious offenses. The Inquisition had its own procedures for investigation and trial. When someone was accused, the Inquisition would investigate to determine if the accusation had merit. If it did, the accused would be arrested and imprisoned. The conditions of Inquisition prisons were generally better than those of secular prisons, though still harsh by modern standards. The accused would be interrogated, sometimes repeatedly over weeks or months. The interrogation followed formal procedures, with questions designed to determine the accused person's beliefs and practices. Confession and repentance were always preferred to conviction and punishment. The Inquisition saw itself as saving souls, not merely punishing bodies. Torture was permitted by the Inquisition, but it was subject to strict regulations. It could only be used when there was strong evidence of guilt, but no confession. It had to be authorized by senior officials. It could be applied only once, though continuation of a torture session could extend this limit. The duration and severity were limited. A physician had to be present to monitor the accused person's condition. These regulations were not always honored, and people certainly suffered terribly under Inquisition torture. But compared to many secular courts of the same period, the Inquisition was relatively restrained. Records suggest that torture was used in, perhaps 10–15% of Inquisition cases, and executions were carried out in only about 2–3% of cases. When the Inquisition did sentence someone to death, and these sentences were carried out by secular authorities, as church officials were prohibited from bloodshed, it was typically by burning at the stake. However, there was a distinction made between relaxation in person and relaxation in effigy. In person meant the actual person was burned. In effigy meant a representation was burned because the person had died, escaped, or repented. Those who confessed and repented, even if guilty, might be reconciled to the church and given lesser punishments, penances, fines, wearing distinctive clothing, public humiliation. The Inquisition preferred this outcome to execution. The Spanish Inquisition's approach to witchcraft was notably skeptical. The most famous case illustrating this is the Basque witch trials of 1609–1614. Accusations of witchcraft in the Basque region led to mass arrests and confessions. However, Alonso de Salazar Frias, an inquisitor assigned to investigate, conducted a thorough examination. He concluded that there was no credible evidence of actual witchcraft, that the confessions had been obtained through pressure and suggestion, and that the panic should be ended rather than encouraged. His recommendations were largely accepted, and the Spanish Inquisition thereafter took a skeptical view of witchcraft accusations. This skepticism stands in stark contrast to the approach taken by many secular authorities, who pursued witch trials with much greater zeal. It's an ironic reversal of popular perception. The infamous Inquisition was actually more rational and restrained regarding witchcraft than the civil authorities. Statistical analysis of witch trial records reveals patterns about who was accused and who was convicted. Women, as mentioned, were the majority of victims, though men were also accused and executed. The women accused tended to be older, often widowed, sometimes quarrelsome or difficult neighbors. They were frequently poor or at least not wealthy. They often practiced folk medicine or midwifery roles that gave them knowledge of herbs and remedies, but also made them vulnerable to accusations when their treatments failed. However, witch accusations could strike anyone. Wealthy women were accused, sometimes by those who sought to seize their property. Young women were accused, sometimes by rejected suitors or jealous rivals. Men were accused, particularly in regions where male witchcraft was seen as credible. Children were sometimes accused or forced to testify against their parents. The accused were often social outsiders, in some way newcomers to a community, those who practiced different trades, those who were eccentric or unsociable. They were people who didn't fit neatly into social structures, who made others uncomfortable, who could be suspected of harboring resentments that might motivate magical revenge. Once accused, the social isolation deepened. Friends and neighbors would distance themselves, afraid of being implicated or of becoming targets themselves. Family members might disavow their accused relative or might be accused alongside them. The accused was alone, facing the full weight of the judicial system with few defenders. The witch hunts began to decline in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, though they continued in some areas into the mid-18th century. Several factors contributed to their end. Intellectual changes associated with the Enlightenment brought increasing skepticism about witchcraft. Educated elites began to view witch trials as superstitious and irrational. Legal reforms reduced the use of torture and raised standards for evidence. Some spectacular trials that resulted in obviously innocent people being convicted helped turn opinion against witch persecution. Religious changes also played a role. As the intensity of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation conflicts diminished, the religious anxieties that had fueled witch hunts also decreased. Both Protestant and Catholic authorities began to discourage witch trials. Economic and social stabilization, as Europe recovered from the upheavals of the 16th and 17th centuries, removed some of the underlying anxieties that had made witch hunts appealing. The last official execution for witchcraft in Western Europe occurred in Switzerland in 1782. In Poland, executions continued until 1793. Unofficial lynchings and witch killings continued in some rural areas even later. The total number of people executed for witchcraft in Europe is difficult to determine precisely, as records are incomplete. Estimates range from 40,000 to 60,000, with perhaps twice that number put on trial. These numbers, while horrific, are lower than the millions sometimes claimed in popular accounts. The witch hunts reveal several disturbing truths about human society and the interaction of law, religion, and torture. They show how judicial torture, even when conducted according to legal procedures, can produce false confessions on a massive scale. Thousands of people confessed to crimes, making pacts with the devil, flying through the air, attending Sabbaths that they could not possibly have committed, because these crimes were impossible. They demonstrate how social anxieties can be channeled into persecution of vulnerable groups. The witch hunts targeted primarily women, particularly older women, those without male protection, those who occupied ambiguous social positions. This gendered persecution reflected and reinforced patriarchal social structures. They illustrate the danger of conspiracy theories. The belief in an organized witch conspiracy, with witches meeting secretly to plot against Christian society, led to chains of accusations where each accused witch was tortured to name accomplices, who were then tortured in turn. Once such a process began, it could be difficult to stop. They show how religious belief can be perverted to justify cruelty. The torture and execution of witches was carried out by people who believed they were serving God, protecting their communities, and saving souls. Their faith did not prevent their cruelty, it motivated and justified it. And they reveal how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil. The witch hunters, the interrogators, the torturers, the judges, most were not monsters, but ordinary individuals caught up in a system and a worldview that made persecution seem necessary and righteous. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval and early modern punishment, we carry these lessons with us. The witch hunts were not an aberration but an extension of existing legal procedures and social anxieties. They took the tools of judicial torture and applied them with particular intensity to a particular imagined threat. And the result was one of the darkest chapters in European history. While torture occurred in dungeons, away from public view, the punishments that followed were often brutally public. The medieval scaffold, the pillory, the whipping post, these stood in town squares and marketplaces, visible reminders of what awaited those who transgressed. Let us now turn our attention to these public spectacles of punishment. In a world without mass media, without widespread literacy, without efficient means of communication, how did authorities communicate their power and the consequences of crime to the population? The answer was through spectacle public punishments that were visible, memorable, and designed to impress upon observers the cost of transgression. Public punishment served multiple functions. It was retribution for the crime committed, satisfying the victim's demand for justice, and the community's sense that wrongdoing must be punished. It was deterrence, showing potential criminals what awaited them if they chose the path of crime. It was a demonstration of authority, a visible exercise of the sovereign's power over the bodies of subjects. But it was also, in a sense, a communal ritual. The public execution or punishment brought the community together as witnesses. They participated in the punishment through their presence, their reactions, sometimes their jeers and thrown objects. The criminal was expelled from the community through death or permanent marking, and this expulsion was a collective act. The public nature of punishment also served a religious function. In a deeply Christian society, the moments before death were seen as crucial for the soul. A criminal who repented and confessed their sins might still achieve salvation, despite the damnation their body faced. The public execution gave the condemned a chance to repent publicly, to ask forgiveness from God and from those they had wronged, to serve as a moral lesson to others. The most severe punishment was death, and death came in various forms, each carrying different social meanings and levels of disgrace. Hanging was the most common form of execution across much of Europe. The condemned would be led to a gallows, a wooden structure with a crossbeam from which ropes could be suspended. A noose would be placed around their neck, and they would be made to stand on a cart, a ladder, or a platform. When the support was removed, the condemned would drop. In the best-case scenario, if the drop was calculated correctly and the neck broke cleanly, death would be relatively quick. But this required skill and calculation that was often lacking. More commonly, the condemned would strangle slowly, dangling and struggling as they suffocated. This could take many minutes, during which the dying person's suffering would be visible to all observers. The body might be left hanging for days or even weeks as a warning to others. Eventually, it would be cut down and buried, usually in unconsecrated ground, as executed criminals were typically denied Christian burial. Sometimes the bodies would be left for birds and animals to consume, adding to the degradation. In some regions, particularly in German-speaking lands, there were elaborate hanging protocols. The height of the gallows, the type of rope used, the position of the body, all of these might vary depending on the crime and the status of the criminal. A nobleman might be granted the mercy of decapitation rather than hanging, as hanging was considered particularly shameful. Beheading by sword or axe was indeed considered a more honorable death, typically reserved for nobles or for those whose crimes, while capital, were not considered especially heinous. The condemned would kneel at a block, and the executioner would strike off their head with a single blow if skilled. An inexperienced or nervous executioner might require multiple blows, turning what should have been a quick death into a prolonged horror. The executioner's skill was a matter of professional pride. A clean execution that severed the head with one stroke was the mark of a master executioner. Failed executions, requiring multiple blows or botched in other ways, damaged the executioner's reputation and could result in loss of position or income. For certain crimes, heresy, witchcraft, sodomy, some forms of treason, burning at the stake, was the prescribed punishment. This was considered the most severe form of execution, not merely killing the body but consuming it entirely, leaving no remains for burial. The condemned would be tied to a stake, usually with wood piled around them. The wood would be lit, and the fire would slowly consume the victim. This was an agonizing death, with the heat causing terrible pain before smoke inhalation, or the flames themselves caused death. In some cases, mercy was shown. A bag of gunpowder might be hung around the condemned's neck, which would explode when the fire reached it, hastening death, or the executioner might strangle the victim before the fire truly took hold, killing them before they could suffer the worst of the burning. But sometimes no mercy was shown. The victim would be fully conscious as the flames rose around them, would feel the fire consuming their flesh, would scream until smoke and flames silenced them. Witnesses reported that the sounds and smells of burning executions were terrible beyond description, yet crowds would still gather to watch. The ashes of those burned at the stake would be scattered, ensuring that no relics remained that might become objects of veneration. This was particularly important in cases of heresy, where authorities feared that the condemned might be viewed as a martyr. We discussed the wheel earlier as a torture device, but it was also a method of execution. After the condemned's limbs had been broken, they would be woven through the spokes of a large wheel, and the wheel would be mounted on a pole for public display. Death from this punishment was slow, sometimes taking days. The victim would die from shock, infection, exposure, and dehydration, their broken body contorted through the wheel spokes. The public display of the broken body served as a powerful deterrent, a visible demonstration of the cost of serious crimes. In some regions, the executioner might be instructed to deliver a killing blow after a certain period of suffering as an act of mercy. In others, nature was allowed to take its course, and the victim might linger for an extended time before death finally came. In England, the most severe punishment for men convicted of high treason was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This elaborate execution combined multiple forms of death and mutilation. The condemned would first be dragged to the place of execution, drawn on a wooden frame called a hurdle. They would then be hanged, but cut down before death occurred. While still conscious, they would be disemboweled, and their intestines and internal organs would be burned before their eyes. Finally, the body would be beheaded and cut into quarters. The head and quarters would be displayed in prominent locations as a warning to others. This punishment was designed to be maximally horrific and humiliating. The victim would experience multiple forms of death: suffocation from hanging, the agony of disembowelment, the final blow of beheading. The quartering and display of the body prevented burial and turned the corpse into a public warning. The most famous example of this punishment was likely the execution of the Gunpowder Plot conspirators in 1606, who had attempted to blow up Parliament and King James I. Their public execution, conducted according to the full ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, served as a spectacular demonstration of the penalty for treason. Not all public punishments involved death. For lesser crimes or as preludes to more severe punishments, various forms of public humiliation were used. The pillory was a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. The offender would be locked in place, standing upright, unable to protect themselves or move away. They would be left like this for hours, while passers-by could jeer, mock, and throw things at them. What was thrown ranged from relatively harmless eggs and rotten vegetables to more dangerous objects like stones or dead animals. The pilloried criminal was completely defenseless, and serious injuries or even death could result from the mob's enthusiasm. The pillory was used for various crimes: fraud, perjury, sedition, immoral behavior. Often, the nature of the crime would be proclaimed on a sign hung around the offender's neck, so that all who saw them would know their offense. The stocks were similar, but different in design. The offender would be seated, with their feet locked in place rather than their head and hands. This was somewhat less severe than the pillory, as the offender's hands were free to protect their face, and the seated position was less exhausting than standing. Both pillory and stocks could be combined with other punishments. An offender might be whipped before being placed in the pillory, or have their ears nailed to the pillory frame, to be torn free when they were released. Branding might be done while an offender was held in the pillory, marking them permanently as a criminal. Flogging or whipping was another common public punishment. The offender would be tied to a post or cart and whipped, often through the streets of the town. The number of lashes, the instrument used: single whip, cat o' nine tails, rods, and the force applied would vary based on the crime and the sentence. Public whipping served the dual purpose of causing pain and humiliation. The victim's body would be exposed, their skin torn by the lashes, blood flowing where the whip broke the skin. They would cry out in pain while onlookers watched. After the whipping, the wounds would be visible for weeks as they healed, a continuing mark of their punishment. Women as well as men were subjected to public whipping, though standards of modesty meant that women were sometimes whipped less severely or in less public settings. However, this mercy was not universal. There are records of women being whipped naked through the streets, their humiliation complete. Permanent marking of criminals served both as punishment and as warning to others. A thief might have a hand cut off, a persistent liar have their tongue cut out, a gossip have their ears cropped. These mutilations were intended to be visible signs of criminality that would follow the offender for the rest of their life. Branding with hot irons was also common. Thieves might be branded with a T on their thumb or forehead. Vagrants might be branded with a V. The brand would identify the person as a criminal to anyone who saw it, making it difficult for them to move to a new place and start fresh. These permanent punishments had severe consequences beyond the immediate pain. A person with a cropped ear or branded forehead would struggle to find employment, to marry, to be accepted in society. They were permanently marked as criminals, and this marking could be a form of social death, even if the physical punishment did not kill them. The crowds who gathered for public punishments were not passive observers. They were active participants, and their participation could take various forms. Sometimes crowds were sympathetic to the condemned. If the criminal was seen as having committed a justified crime, or if the punishment seemed excessive, the crowd might express their disapproval. They might pray for the condemned, might weep, might express anger at the authorities. Other times, crowds were hostile to the condemned. They might jeer and mock, might throw objects, might celebrate the punishment as just and deserved. The crowd's reaction could influence the severity of punishment. A sympathetic crowd might cause authorities to show mercy, while a hostile crowd might encourage harsher treatment. The crowd could also become unruly. Public executions and punishments sometimes sparked riots, either because the crowd disagreed with the proceedings, or simply because large gatherings of people could become volatile. Authorities had to balance their desire for public spectacle with the risk of losing control of the crowd. Children were often brought to public punishments, as these were seen as educational opportunities. Seeing the consequences of crime was thought to instill virtue and obedience. How this affected children psychologically is difficult to determine, but they grew up in a society where public violence was normalized and accepted. The period between sentencing and execution was filled with ritual and meaning. The condemned might be visited by priests or ministers, who would hear confession and offer spiritual counsel. This was seen as important even if the body was forfeit. The soul might still be saved through genuine repentance. On the day of execution, the condemned might be paraded through the streets to the place of execution. This procession served multiple purposes. It allowed the maximum number of people to see the condemned and be reminded of the cost of crime. It gave the condemned a final chance to see the world they were leaving, and it provided an opportunity for final religious observances. At the scaffold or stake, the condemned might be given an opportunity to address the crowd. These final speeches varied enormously. Some condemned criminals proclaimed their innocence, insisted they had been wrongly convicted, asked for prayers for their souls. Others confessed their crimes, expressed repentance, and urged others to avoid the path that had led them to this end. These final words were important to the authorities and to the crowd. A criminal who confessed and repented validated the justice of their punishment. They showed that the system worked, that the guilty acknowledged their guilt, that justice was done. A criminal who protested their innocence to the end was more troubling, raising questions about whether the execution was truly just. Some of the condemned faced death with courage that impressed observers. They might joke with the executioner, might refuse to show fear, might meet their end with dignity. These displays of courage could transform a common criminal into a folk hero, someone the community remembered with a mixture of disapproval and admiration. Others faced death with terror, weeping, begging for mercy, having to be dragged to the scaffold or stake. This terror was also instructive to the crowd, a visceral demonstration of the fear that punishment should inspire. After the execution, the body became the property of the state. Depending on the crime and local custom, it might be buried, displayed, dissected, or left for animals. Executed criminals were typically denied burial in consecrated ground, as they had died unreconciled to the church, even if they had confessed and repented. The act of execution placed them outside normal religious practice. Bodies of executed criminals might be displayed as warnings. Heads might be placed on spikes at city gates. Bodies might be hung in cages at crossroads. This practice served to extend the punishment beyond death, to transform the body into a permanent warning. The rotting corpses, gradually consumed by weather and animals, were grim reminders of what awaited those who transgressed. In some places, the bodies of executed criminals could be claimed by physicians and surgeons for dissection and anatomical study. This was seen as a final indignity. Not only was the criminal dead, but their body was cut apart and studied. This practice actually advanced medical knowledge, as human dissection was otherwise rare. but it was another way in which the condemned was stripped of dignity even in death. Families of the executed often suffered additional punishment. They might be shunned by the community, might have property seized, might struggle to survive the social stigma. Children of executed criminals could find it difficult to marry, to find work, to escape the shadow of their parents' crime and punishment. Yet there were also examples of mercy and compassion. Some communities would quietly bury executed criminals in unmarked graves, giving them at least some dignity in death. Some families were allowed to claim bodies for private burial. Some priests would offer prayers for the souls of the executed, despite official prohibitions. The complexity of human response, the mixture of cruelty and compassion, judgment and mercy, fear and sympathy, was on full display in the aftermath of public punishments. We have now journeyed through the dungeons, the torture chambers, the trial procedures, and the public spectacles of medieval punishment. We have seen how suffering was systematized, how cruelty was legitimized, how pain became procedure. In our next section, we will examine the lives of those who administered these punishments, the executioners, torturers, and jailers who occupied the dark margins of medieval society. We will explore how ordinary humans could take up these professions, how they were viewed by their communities, and how they understood their own roles in the machinery of medieval justice. But for now, let these images settle in your mind. Public punishments, for all their horror, remind us of something important. They were public because they were meant to teach. And what they taught was fear, conformity, and the awesome power of authority. The medieval scaffold was a classroom where lessons were written in blood, and everyone was required to attend. To truly understand medieval punishment, we must examine those who administered it, the executioners, torturers, and jailers who occupied a unique and troubling position in medieval society. These were the men and occasionally women whose hands carried out the sentences that judges pronounced, whose skill or clumsiness could make the difference between a quick death and prolonged agony. The executioner occupied one of the most paradoxical positions in medieval society. On one hand, he was essential. Justice could not be administered without someone to carry out sentences. On the other hand, he was reviled, feared, and socially marginalized to a degree that seems remarkable to modern sensibilities. In many parts of Europe, executioners were considered dishonorable people, a legal category that placed them outside normal society. They could not marry into respectable families. They could not join guilds or practice most trades. They had to live in separate quarters of towns, often near the gallows or city walls. They had to wear distinctive clothing or badges so that others would know to avoid them. This dishonor extended to their families. The children of executioners inherited their father's taint. They might be barred from schools, from churches, from normal social interaction. The only trades typically open to them were those already considered dishonorable: executioner, of course, but also knacker, disposal of dead animals, latrine cleaner, and a few other degraded occupations. Why this intense stigma? Several factors contributed. Contact with death and blood was considered polluting in both religious and folk tradition. The executioner dealt in death daily, making him a figure of spiritual danger. There was also the practical consideration that executioners had power over life and death, making them both necessary and frightening to ordinary people. Yet despite this social degradation, the position of executioner could be surprisingly lucrative. Executioners were paid for their services, receiving fees for each execution, torture session, and punishment they administered. These fees could be substantial, particularly for skilled executioners whose services were in demand. Additionally, executioners had certain traditional privileges. They might have the right to collect fees from merchants at markets. They could claim the clothing and belongings of those they executed. They sometimes received payments from prisoners or their families for a quick death, for reduced torture, for better treatment. Some executioners became quite wealthy through the accumulation of these various revenues. Because executioners were socially isolated, and because their children were barred from most other occupations, the profession tended to become hereditary. Executioner dynasties developed, with the trade passing from father to son across multiple generations. The most famous executioner dynasty was probably the Sanson family of France, who held the position of executioner of Paris from 1688 to 1847, spanning 7 generations. Charles Henry Sanson, the fourth in the line, was the executioner during the French Revolution and personally executed King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and thousands of others during the Terror. But there were many other executioner families across Europe. In Germany, the Reichardt family produced executioners across several centuries. In England, executioner positions were less formally hereditary, but still often passed within families, or were given to men from executioner backgrounds. These dynasties developed their own traditions, techniques, and professional pride. A skilled executioner took pride in a clean beheading, a properly adjusted hanging, an efficiently conducted punishment. The craft was taught carefully from father to son, with techniques refined over generations. The family nature of the profession also meant that executioners often married within their caste. An executioner's daughter would typically marry another executioner or the son of an executioner. These marriages created networks of professional relationships across regions, with techniques and knowledge shared among executioner families. Being an executioner required considerable skill. A beheading looked simple, one stroke of the sword or axe, but required extensive practice to master. The executioner had to judge the angle correctly, deliver the blow with sufficient force, account for any movement by the condemned. A botched beheading that required multiple strokes was a professional embarrassment and could provoke crowd violence. Executioners practiced their craft on cadavers of animals or unclaimed human bodies. They learned the anatomy of the neck, the proper angle of the blade, the amount of force required. Some executioners became so skilled that they could behead multiple people in quick succession with machine-like efficiency, as happened during the French Revolution. Hanging required different skills. The executioner had to calculate the drop distance based on the condemned person's weight. Too short a drop and death would be by slow strangulation. Too long and the head might be torn from the body, spectacular but considered improper. The knot had to be positioned correctly. The rope had to be of appropriate strength and thickness. For torture, the executioner needed to know how to operate various devices, how to calibrate pain without causing premature death or unconsciousness, how to read a victim's condition. A torture session that ended too quickly because the victim died or passed out was a failure. The executioner had to maintain the victim in a state of maximal suffering while preserving their ability to confess. The executioner's tools were his professional instruments, and he maintained them carefully. Swords and axes had to be kept sharp. Ropes had to be checked for wear. Torture devices had to be kept in working order. An executioner took pride in his tools, and some families had swords or axes that were used for generations, acquiring an almost legendary status. In addition to technical skills, executioners needed psychological fortitude. They had to be able to kill and torture without visible emotion, to maintain professional composure while inflicting terrible suffering. This emotional detachment was essential to the role, but must have taken a psychological toll. What was daily life like for a medieval executioner? The answer varied depending on location and time period, but we can reconstruct a general picture. In smaller towns, executions might be infrequent, perhaps a handful per year. The executioner would have other duties to fill his time. He might serve as jailer, responsible for maintaining the prison and guarding prisoners. He might perform other town services, clearing dead animals from streets, maintaining the gallows and pillory, serving as a constable or watchman. In larger cities, particularly during periods of intense persecution or political upheaval, the executioner might be busy indeed. There are records of executioners carrying out multiple executions in a single day, or conducting torture sessions for many prisoners in succession. Preparation for an execution began well before the actual event. The executioner would be notified of the sentence and the scheduled date. He would prepare his tools, sharpening blades, testing ropes, ensuring everything was in order. He might meet with the condemned to discuss any final requests or to assess their physical condition. On the day of execution, the executioner would typically accompany the condemned from the prison to the place of execution. In some traditions, the executioner would ask the condemned for forgiveness, before carrying out the sentence, a ritual that acknowledged the personal nature of the act while maintaining its official character. After the executioner would dispose of the body according to local custom and the terms of the sentence. He would clean his tools, collect his fee, and return to his quarters. If there had been any irregularities or problems with the execution, he might face questions or criticism from authorities. The executioner's home life was largely separate from the rest of the community. He would live with his family, teach his sons the trade, arrange marriages for his daughters within the executioner caste. His wife and daughters might assist with certain tasks, preparing meals for prisoners, cleaning, maintaining the household while the executioner carried out his duties. What psychological impact did this work have on those who performed it? The historical record provides some clues, though we must be cautious about projecting modern psychological concepts onto the past. Some executioners seem to have been genuinely troubled by their work. There are records of executioners who drank heavily, who suffered from nightmares, who sought frequent confession from priests. The executioner Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, who kept a detailed diary of his work from 1573 to 1617, recorded executing 361 people and carrying out numerous lesser punishments. His diary entries are largely factual and unemotional, but there are hints of the psychological weight he carried. Other executioners seem to have developed effective psychological defenses. They viewed themselves as servants of justice, fulfilling a necessary social function. The condemned were criminals who deserved their fate. The executioner was merely the instrument through which society's will was enacted. This rationalization allowed them to continue their work without unbearable guilt. Some executioners may have been genuinely callous, or even sadistic, finding satisfaction in their work. However, such individuals were probably the minority. Most executioners were ordinary men who had been born into the profession, and who carried it out because it was their lot in life. The social isolation of executioners may have actually helped them psychologically. Living apart from the community, socializing primarily with other executioner families, they created their own social world, where their profession was normalized. Within executioner society, they could find understanding and support that the broader community would not provide. Certain executioners became famous or infamous in their own time, and have been remembered by history. Charles Henry Sanson, mentioned earlier, is perhaps the most famous. As the royal executioner during the French Revolution, he was responsible for executing King Louis XVI on January 21, 1793. The execution of a king was an extraordinary event, and Sanson's role in it ensured his place in history. He later wrote that he had found the king's courage at the scaffold impressive, and that the execution had troubled him deeply. Sanson continued as executioner through the Terror, executing thousands during the period when the guillotine worked almost daily. After the Revolution, he remained executioner under Napoleon and the restored Bourbon monarchy. His memoirs, though their authenticity is disputed, provide fascinating insights into the life of an executioner. Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, whose diary we mentioned, provides one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of an executioner's work. His entries are terse but informative. Hans Ferschel of Schwabach, who with his brother committed 3 murders and many robberies, has been executed with the sword on this date. Barbara Schwemmelrin, who murdered her child at birth, drowned by me. Over 44 years, Schmidt documented a complete career in execution. In England, the Ketch family became synonymous with execution. Jack Ketch served as executioner from approximately 1663 to 1686 and became so infamous for his incompetence that his name became slang for executioner and later for the hangman figure in Punch and Judy shows. He notoriously botched the execution of the Duke of Monmouth in 1685, requiring multiple blows to sever the head. Paradoxically, executioners often also served as healers in medieval society. Because they dealt with bodies and blood, because they understood anatomy from their grim work, they possessed knowledge that could be turned to healing purposes. Executioners often served as surgeons, particularly for procedures that other medical practitioners disdained or found too degrading, setting bones, treating wounds, amputations. They might also serve as tooth pullers, a necessary if painful service in an age before modern dentistry. Moreover, parts of executed criminals' bodies were believed to have medicinal or magical properties. The hand of a hanged man was thought to cure diseases or bring good luck. Blood from a beheaded criminal was believed to cure epilepsy. The fat of executed criminals could be made into salves for various ailments. The executioner controlled access to these materials and could sell them for additional income. These beliefs seem grotesque to modern sensibilities, but they were widespread in medieval and early modern Europe. The executioner, as the person with access to fresh corpses, became a broker in this trade in body parts and fluids. This added another dimension to his economic position and another reason for people to seek him out. Despite his social stigma, the position and status of executioners varied considerably across Europe. In some regions, they were more integrated into society, in others, more severely ostracized. In Germany and parts of Central Europe, the dishonor attached to executioners was particularly intense and legally codified. Executioners and their families were explicitly barred from many activities and associations. This formal exclusion persisted longer in German-speaking lands than elsewhere. In France, executioners had a somewhat more complex status. While they were still socially marginal, they held official positions and could accumulate considerable wealth and property. The Sanson family, for instance, owned substantial property and lived relatively comfortably. In England, the status of executioners was less formalized and perhaps slightly less degraded than on the continent. English executioners were often simply men hired for the job, rather than members of hereditary executioner castes. The social stigma existed but was less institutionalized. In Spain and Italy, executioners often worked for the Inquisition as well as for secular courts. Their status depended partly on which authority they served. Those who worked primarily for the church might have slightly higher status than those who worked only for secular authorities. In Eastern Europe and Russia, executioners often had connections to military service, and the profession might be less stigmatized than in Western Europe. The specific cultural contexts shaped how executioners were viewed and treated. As torture and capital punishment declined in the 18th and 19th centuries, the executioner's profession changed. In some places, the role disappeared entirely as capital punishment was abolished. In others, it became more specialized and more hidden from public view. The introduction of the guillotine in France during the Revolution was seen as a reform, a more humane and egalitarian method of execution. Everyone, regardless of social class, would face the same quick death. The guillotine also reduced the skill required. Any executioner could operate it effectively, whereas beheading by sword or axe required extensive training. Other technological developments included the long drop hanging method, which was more reliably quick than earlier hanging methods, and eventually the electric chair and gas chamber in some jurisdictions. Each of these changes altered the executioner's role, making it more mechanical and less personal. As executions moved from public squares to prison yards, the executioner became less visible. He was no longer a public figure carrying out justice before crowds, but a functionary working behind prison walls. This increased privacy also began to reduce the social stigma. An executioner could live a relatively normal life when his work was hidden from view. In the 20th century, as more countries abolished capital punishment, the profession of executioner gradually disappeared in much of Europe. By the end of the century, executioners existed primarily in countries that still practiced capital punishment: the United States, various Asian and Middle Eastern countries, and others. The last executioner in France was Marcel Chevalier, who served from 1976 until France abolished the death penalty in 1981. With the end of capital punishment in France, a profession that had existed for centuries came to an end. The executioner has lived on in cultural memory long after the profession itself disappeared. In literature, film, and popular culture, the executioner remains a powerful symbol, sometimes of justice, sometimes of oppression, sometimes of the dark side of authority. The hooded executioner with his axe or sword has become an iconic image, though it often bears little resemblance to historical reality. Most executioners did not wear hoods, and their clothing was distinctive but not sinister. Yet the popular image persists because it captures something about our relationship with death and punishment, the sense that those who deal in death are mysterious, frightening, and apart from ordinary humanity. In some folk traditions, executioners became almost mythical figures. Stories grew around famous executioners, often attributing to them supernatural abilities or knowledge. The executioner might appear as a wise figure who understood life's deepest mysteries, or as a grim specter reminding us of mortality. Modern examinations of executioners have tried to humanize them, to understand them not as monsters but as people caught in a particular historical circumstance. Books like Joel Harrington's The Faithful Executioner, about Franz Schmidt, present executioners as complex individuals struggling with the demands of their role. The figure of the executioner forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, punishment, and human nature. These were people who made their living through death and suffering. They were necessary to the functioning of medieval justice, yet were despised for the necessity they fulfilled. We might judge them harshly, viewing them as willing participants in systems of cruelty. But we must also recognize the constraints under which they operated. Most were born into the profession, inheriting both the role and the stigma. They had little choice about their life's work. And within that work, some strove to be skilled and professional, to minimize suffering where they could, to serve justice as they understood it. The executioner reminds us that systems of punishment require human agents to carry them out. Someone must turn the rack, swing the sword, light the fire. These agents are not abstract forces but individuals with their own psychology, their own moral reasoning, their own struggles. Understanding them helps us understand the systems they served, and our own continuing relationship with punishment and death. For all the brutality of medieval justice, there were also mechanisms for mercy, ways in which the harsh letter of the law could be softened. Understanding these exceptions and mercies is as important as understanding the punishments themselves, for they reveal the complexity of medieval legal and social systems. One of the most important forms of mercy in medieval Europe was the right of sanctuary. This was the ancient practice by which a criminal could seek refuge in a church or other sacred space and be immune from arrest. The concept of sanctuary had roots in Jewish and early Christian tradition. Certain places were designated as holy ground where violence was forbidden, and where those fleeing vengeance could find protection. The medieval church expanded this concept, declaring that any church or consecrated space could serve as sanctuary. A person who had committed a crime could flee to a church, and once within its precincts, they could not be forcibly removed by secular authorities. This was a powerful check on secular power and a manifestation of the church's independent authority. The idea was that the church, representing God's mercy, could offer protection even to those whom secular law condemned. However, sanctuary was not a permanent escape. In England, for instance, a person who claimed sanctuary had to confess their crime to a coroner and agree to abjure the realm to leave England permanently. They would be given a specific time period, usually 40 days, to make their way to a port and depart the country. During this journey, they were supposed to walk in the middle of the road, carrying a cross, so that everyone would know they were an abjurer under church protection. If the sanctuary seeker refused to abjure the realm, they could remain in the church indefinitely, but they also could not leave. They would become dependent on the charity of the church and community for food and other necessities. Few people could sustain this existence for long. Sanctuary was not absolute. Certain serious crimes, treason, sacrilege might not be covered by sanctuary rites, and over time, secular authorities found ways to erode the practice. They might besiege the church, preventing food from entering, effectively starving out the refugee. They might pressure church authorities to surrender the fugitive. By the 16th century, sanctuary rights were being increasingly restricted in many parts of Europe. The English Reformation limited sanctuary significantly, and by 1623, it was largely abolished. Other countries followed similar trajectories, though at different paces. Nevertheless, for several centuries, sanctuary represented a significant mercy in the justice system. It gave criminals a chance to escape capital punishment, provided time for tempers to cool, and sometimes allowed for negotiated settlements between criminals and their victims. Kings and other sovereigns held the power to pardon criminals or commute their sentences. This power of mercy was an important aspect of royal authority, demonstrating both the sovereign's power over life and death and his capacity for Christian mercy. Pardons might be granted for various reasons. Sometimes they were acts of pure mercy, perhaps moved by the pleas of the condemned's family or by the sovereign's own compassion. Sometimes they were political calculations. Pardoning a criminal might win the loyalty of their family or faction. Sometimes they were sold criminals, or their families might purchase pardons. The power to pardon also served as a safety valve in the justice system. If a conviction seemed unjust, if new evidence emerged, if circumstances changed, a pardon could correct the error without having to formally acknowledge that the legal system had failed. Amnesties were broader than individual pardons, offering forgiveness to entire categories of criminals. These might be declared on special occasions: a royal wedding, the birth of an heir, a religious festival. Amnesties might exclude certain serious crimes like murder or treason, but could free many lesser offenders. Commutation of sentence was another form of mercy. Instead of execution, a criminal might have their sentence reduced to imprisonment, exile, or corporal punishment. This allowed justice to be seen to be done while sparing the criminal's life. In medieval England and some other jurisdictions, clergy had the right to be tried in ecclesiastical courts rather than secular courts. Ecclesiastical courts generally could not impose death sentences, so this benefit of clergy could literally be a lifesaver for those who could claim it. The definition of who counted as clergy was surprisingly broad. Originally, it meant ordained priests, monks, and other church officials. However, the test for clerical status became the ability to read. A person accused of a crime could claim benefit of clergy if they could read a passage from the Bible, typically Psalm 51:1, which became known as the neck verse because reading it could save one's neck from the noose. This created an odd situation where literacy became a get-out-of-jail-free card. Educated laypeople, particularly nobles and the wealthy who could read, could claim benefit of clergy, even though they were not actually clergy. Meanwhile, illiterate genuine clergy might be denied the benefit because they could not read. Over time, authorities recognized this loophole and began restricting benefit of clergy. It was limited to first-time offenders. Certain crimes were excluded from its protection. Those who claimed benefit of clergy were often branded on the thumb to prevent them from claiming it again. Nevertheless, benefit of clergy represented a significant mercy in the system, allowing many people to escape capital punishment. It also incentivized literacy, as learning to read could literally save your life. Medieval legal systems did develop some mechanisms for appeal and review of sentences, though these were less developed and less accessible than modern appellate systems. In many jurisdictions, particularly those influenced by Roman law, there were hierarchies of courts. A decision by a lower court might be appealed to a higher court. The Supreme Courts, the Parliament of Paris in France, the Reichskammergericht in the Holy Roman Empire could review cases and overturn convictions. However, the appeal process was expensive and time-consuming. It required legal knowledge and often the services of trained advocates. This made it accessible primarily to the wealthy and well-connected. A poor person convicted in a local court was unlikely to successfully appeal to a distant Supreme Court. Religious cases could be appealed to Rome, to the papal court. This was a slow process. It could take years for a case to make its way through the ecclesiastical hierarchy. But it did provide another avenue for those who could afford it and who had the patience to pursue it. Women who were convicted of capital crimes could plead their belly claim to be pregnant. If a jury of matrons confirmed the pregnancy, execution would be postponed until after the child was born. The reasoning was that the unborn child was innocent and should not be punished for the mother's crimes. In practice, this plea could save a woman's life. By the time the child was born and weaned, circumstances might have changed. A pardon might be granted, the sentence might be commuted, or authorities might simply lose interest in carrying out the execution. Some women who pleaded pregnancy were never executed, though this was not guaranteed. There were, of course, temptations to fraud. A woman might claim to be pregnant when she was not, hoping to delay execution and perhaps escape it entirely. The jury of matrons was supposed to prevent such fraud, but they were not always effective. In early medieval Germanic law, many crimes could be settled through compensation rather than punishment. This system, known as Wehrgeld or Wehrgild, literally man price, assigned monetary values to different injuries and crimes. If someone killed another person, they or their family would have to pay Wehrgeld to the victim's family. The amount varied based on the social status of the victim. Killing a noble required higher payment than killing a peasant. This system allowed for resolution of disputes without the cycle of blood feuds that could tear communities apart. Lesser injuries also had assigned compensations. Breaking someone's arm, putting out an eye, cutting off a finger all had specific prices. Legal codes would list these in great detail, providing a schedule of compensation for every conceivable injury. This system gradually gave way to state-administered justice, where crimes were seen as offenses against the king's peace rather than private wrongs. By the High Medieval period, Wehrgeld was largely replaced by criminal prosecution and punishment. However, elements of the compensation system persisted in the form of fines and restitution. While medieval law did not have the same clear concept of juvenile status that modern law does, there was some recognition that young children should not be fully responsible for their actions. Very young children, typically those under 7, were generally considered incapable of forming criminal intent, and therefore could not be prosecuted for crimes. Children between 7 and 14 occupied a gray area. They might be prosecuted depending on the nature of the crime and whether they seemed to understand the wrongfulness of their actions. Even when children were prosecuted and convicted, they sometimes received more lenient sentences than adults would have for the same crime. Corporal punishment might be substituted for execution, or pardons might be more readily granted. However, we should not overstate this leniency. There are records of children as young as 8 or 10 being executed for crimes like theft or arson. The mercy shown to youth was inconsistent and often inadequate by modern standards. A person's reputation and social standing could significantly affect their treatment in the justice system. Someone with a reputation for honesty and good behavior might receive more lenient treatment than a known troublemaker accused of the same crime. This consideration of character was sometimes formalized through the system of compurgation, where oath helpers would swear to the accused person's good character and honesty. If enough oath helpers of sufficient standing could be found, this might be enough to avoid conviction. Nobles and other high-status individuals benefited significantly from their position. They might be tried in different courts, subjected to less severe interrogation and torture, given more comfortable imprisonment, and receive more lenient sentences if convicted. This was not seen as unjust in medieval terms. Different social classes had different rights and obligations, and these extended to the justice system. Various people might intercede on behalf of a convicted criminal, asking for mercy. Family members might petition the king or local lord. Church officials might argue for clemency. Sometimes whole communities might petition if they felt a sentence was unjust or excessive. The effectiveness of these petitions depended on the petitioner's status and connections, the nature of the crime, and the disposition of the authority being petitioned. A powerful noble arguing for clemency might be effective. A poor family's pleas might be ignored. Queens and noblewomen sometimes specialized in intercession, playing a formal role as advocates for mercy. This was seen as appropriately feminine. Men administered justice. Women pleaded for mercy. Many pardons and commutations were granted at the request of queens or other high-ranking women. Beyond these formal mechanisms, there were many unofficial ways in which harsh sentences might be avoided or softened. A guard might look the other way while a prisoner escaped. An executioner might botch an execution accidentally, giving the condemned a chance to survive and claim divine intervention. A community might hide a fugitive or refuse to cooperate with authorities seeking to arrest someone. Juries sometimes refused to convict despite clear evidence of guilt, particularly when the crime was minor and the prescribed punishment seemed excessive. This jury nullification was not formally recognized, but was nevertheless an important safety valve. Officials might simply choose not to prosecute certain crimes or criminals. Resources were limited, and not every crime could be pursued with equal vigor. Discretion in prosecution provided another avenue for informal mercy. The existence of these various forms of mercy creates a paradox. On one hand, they mitigated the harshness of medieval law and provided ways for justice to be tempered with compassion. On the other hand, they made the system more arbitrary and unequal. If you were wealthy, well-connected, male, literate, and of good reputation, you had many avenues to escape or reduce punishment. If you were poor, friendless, female, illiterate, and of ill repute, you had few. The same crime might result in execution for one person and a pardon for another, depending entirely on factors unrelated to the actual guilt or innocence. This arbitrariness was not seen as a bug but as a feature. Justice was supposed to be personal, to take into account individual circumstances. The idea of equal treatment under law, regardless of status, was foreign to medieval thinking. Different people had different places in society, and it was right and proper that they be treated differently by the law. Yet this system also meant that mercy was not predictable or reliable. It depended on factors largely beyond the control of the accused, the mood of the king, the success of petitioners, the sympathy of juries, the discretion of officials. For those facing punishment, these various avenues for mercy represented hope, but hope that might or might not be realized. The granting or withholding of mercy was often a political act. A king who showed mercy demonstrated his power. He could override the law because he was sovereign. But he also demonstrated Christian virtue and won loyalty from those he spared and their families. Conversely, refusing mercy sent a message. It showed that the sovereign would not tolerate certain crimes, that justice would be carried out regardless of pleas for clemency. The decision of when to show mercy and when to insist on full punishment was a delicate political calculation. Amnesties and mass pardons were often timed for maximum political effect, granting widespread clemency at a time of celebration, a coronation, a royal wedding, a military victory associated the monarch with generosity and kindness. It turned a moment of personal or national triumph into a display of magnanimity. But mercy could also be selective and divisive. Pardoning one faction's criminals while executing another's was a way of rewarding friends and punishing enemies. This political use of mercy made it another tool of power rather than a simple expression of compassion. Paradoxically, as the legal system became more humane in the modern period, some of these traditional forms of mercy declined. Sanctuary was abolished. Benefit of clergy was eliminated. The standardization of law and reduction in severity of punishment meant that many of the old safety valves became unnecessary. Modern legal systems emphasize equality and predictability rather than individualized consideration. Everyone is supposed to be treated the same regardless of status. While modern systems have their own forms of mercy, plea bargaining, parole, executive clemency, these operate differently than medieval forms. There are gains and losses in this transformation. Modern systems are more equal and predictable, but perhaps less flexible. Medieval systems were arbitrary and unequal, but allowed for individual circumstances to be considered. Neither approach is perfect. Both involve trade-offs between different values. The system of judicial torture that had been entrenched in European law for centuries did not disappear overnight. Its decline was gradual, uneven, and driven by multiple factors: intellectual, social, political, and economic. Understanding this decline helps us see how societies can move away from institutionalized cruelty, though the process is neither simple nor inevitable. The most famous intellectual attack on judicial torture came from Cesare Beccaria, an Italian philosopher and jurist. His 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments, De Deliti e del Pene, provided a systematic critique of the existing criminal justice system, including torture. Beccaria argued that torture was illogical and counterproductive. The guilty person who was strong might resist torture and go free, while the innocent person who was weak might confess to crimes they had not committed. Torture thus served not to discover truth, but to reward physical strength and punish weakness. This was the opposite of what justice should do. Moreover, Beccaria argued the very need for torture suggested that the evidence was insufficient for conviction. If the evidence was strong enough, no confession was needed. If it was not strong enough, torture was being used to overcome the lack of evidence, essentially creating evidence through pain rather than discovering it through investigation. Beccaria's work was not the first to question torture. There had been critics before him. But his arguments came at the right time, when intellectual and cultural conditions made them more likely to be heard. The Enlightenment emphasis on reason, on evidence, on the dignity of the individual, created a climate where Beccaria's critique could gain traction. Voltaire, the famous French philosopher, took up the cause through his writings on specific cases. The most famous was the Calas affair. Jean Calas, a Protestant merchant in Toulouse, was accused of murdering his son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism. Calas was tortured and executed in 1762. Voltaire became convinced of Calas's innocence and waged a publicity campaign that eventually led to Calas being posthumously exonerated. Voltaire used the Calas case to attack judicial torture more broadly. He argued that torture was not just ineffective, but actively harmful, leading to false confessions and the execution of innocent people. His writings reached a broad audience and helped turn public opinion against torture. Other Enlightenment thinkers joined the critique. Montesquieu argued that torture was incompatible with the principles of a free society. The encyclopedists, compiling their great encyclopedia of knowledge, included articles critical of torture. A consensus began to form among educated elites that torture was barbaric and should be abolished. The intellectual critique of torture was followed by legal reforms. Different countries moved at different paces, but the overall trend was toward abolition. Prussia under Frederick the Great abolished judicial torture in 1754, though with some exceptions. This was early and reflected Frederick's Enlightenment sympathies, but the reform was not immediately followed by other German states. Sweden abolished torture in 1772. Austria followed in 1776, though the reforms were gradual and some forms of coercive interrogation persisted. Poland abolished torture in 1776 as well, as part of broader legal reforms. France, despite being a center of Enlightenment thought, was relatively slow to reform. Torture was officially abolished in 1788, though the revolution would soon bring new forms of state violence. The abolition came after years of debate and criticism, and it represented a recognition that the old system had lost legitimacy. In the Holy Roman Empire, the various states abolished torture at different times throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The last state to formally abolish it was Bavaria in 1806. Spain abolished torture in 1790, and the Spanish Inquisition followed suit shortly after, ceasing the use of torture in its investigations. England, which had never institutionalized judicial torture as part of its common law, formally prohibited it completely by the end of the 18th century, ending even the exceptional use that had been permitted in state security cases. Russia abolished torture in 1801, though enforcement of this prohibition was inconsistent, and forms of harsh interrogation continued. By the early 19th century, judicial torture had been formally abolished throughout most of Europe. The legal framework that had sustained it for centuries had crumbled, replaced by new conceptions of criminal justice that emphasized evidence, procedure, and the rights of the accused. The abolition of torture was not simply the result of Enlightenment philosophers convincing people that torture was wrong. Multiple factors contributed to the change. Economic and social changes, the growth of commercial economies, and the rise of the middle class created new social dynamics. Merchants and traders valued predictability and rationality in law. Arbitrary justice that depended on torture and confession seemed incompatible with the rational organization of economic life. Growth of state power. As states became more centralized and powerful, they developed better means of investigation and law enforcement. Police forces became more professional and effective. Forensic techniques, while primitive by modern standards, began to develop. With better investigation, torture became less necessary for solving crimes. Changes in punishment philosophy. The purpose of punishment began to shift from public spectacle and physical suffering toward imprisonment and reform. As prisons became the primary means of punishment, the need for elaborate public executions and torture declined. The body of the criminal was no longer the primary text on which punishment was written. Religious changes, the decline in religious uniformity after the Reformation and the gradual separation of church and state meant that religious crimes became less central to the justice system. Heresy, once a major category requiring torture to detect and punish, became less important as religious tolerance increased. Military developments, changes in warfare and military organization also played a role. As armies became more professional and less dependent on feudal levies, the martial culture that had valorized physical toughness and the endurance of pain began to decline. A more bureaucratic culture of military professionalism emerged. Public opinion, the spread of literacy, and the growth of print media meant that accounts of torture and execution reached broader audiences. What had once been local events known only through rumor and oral tradition now could be read about across countries. This wider awareness may have contributed to growing revulsion against torture. Practical failures, the system of judicial torture had always produced some obviously false confessions and wrongful convictions. As these became more widely known and publicized, they undermined confidence in torture as a truth-finding mechanism. The case of Jean Calles was just one of many that suggested torture was unreliable. Despite formal abolition, torture did not completely disappear. It persisted in various forms and contexts, a reminder that legal reform does not always translate to immediate practical change. In colonial contexts, European powers often used torture against colonized peoples, even after it had been abolished at home. The rules that applied to European subjects did not always apply to colonial subjects. Torture in colonies continued well into the 20th century, even by countries that had abolished it domestically centuries earlier. During wartime, torture often reappeared under different names. Enhanced interrogation, the third degree, intensive questioning. These euphemisms masked practices that were recognizably forms of torture. The 20th century, despite being the age when torture was formally prohibited by international law, saw torture used on a massive scale in various conflicts and by various regimes. Police torture, while officially prohibited, persisted in many countries. The third-degree brutal police interrogation methods, designed to extract confessions, was common in many countries through the 19th and early 20th centuries. Even today, despite international prohibitions, torture by police and security forces remains a problem in many parts of the world. Authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century used torture systematically. Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, various dictatorships in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and elsewhere all employed torture, despite it being formally illegal. The gap between legal prohibition and actual practice could be enormous. The 20th century saw the development of international law, explicitly prohibiting torture. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948 stated that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The Convention Against Torture 1984 created international legal obligations to prevent and punish torture. These international instruments reflected a consensus, at least at the level of formal legal commitments, that torture is absolutely prohibited. There are no exceptions for security emergencies, no allowances for severe crimes, no circumstances under which torture is legally permissible. Yet the persistence of torture in practice shows the gap between legal ideals and ground-level reality. Countries that have signed treaties prohibiting torture sometimes engage in it anyway. The euphemism of enhanced interrogation techniques, used by the United States in the early 21st century, showed how torture could return even in democratic societies committed to the rule of law. Even as actual torture declined in Western countries, it became more prominent in popular culture and imagination. Torture scenes in movies, television shows, and books became common, far more common than torture had been in medieval popular entertainment. This cultural prominence of torture is paradoxical. In societies where torture is illegal and rare, it becomes a source of fascination and entertainment. In the medieval period, When torture was legal and common, it was not a major theme in popular culture. The romance of torture is possible only when torture is distant and abstract, rather than immediate and real. The ticking time bomb scenario, a hypothetical situation where torture might be necessary to prevent catastrophe, became a staple of popular entertainment. This scenario, which almost never occurs in reality, became a way of maintaining the idea that torture might sometimes be necessary or justified, despite its legal prohibition. The decline of judicial torture offers several lessons about how entrenched practices can change. First, intellectual critique matters. The arguments of Beccaria, Voltaire, and other Enlightenment thinkers helped delegitimize torture and create pressure for reform. Ideas, when they resonate with social and cultural conditions, can drive institutional change. Second, change is gradual and uneven. Torture was not abolished everywhere at once, but declined over decades and centuries, with different places moving at different speeds. Even after formal abolition, torture persisted in various forms and contexts. Third, legal change requires supporting social and institutional changes. Abolishing torture required not just changing laws but developing alternative methods of investigation, different punishment philosophies, and new institutional arrangements. Legal reform without these supporting changes is unlikely to be effective. Fourth, backsliding is always possible. The reappearance of torture in the 20th and 21st centuries, despite its formal abolition and international prohibition, shows that progress is not irreversible. Societies must actively maintain their commitments to human rights, or they risk regression. Finally, the gap between formal law and actual practice can be significant. Laws prohibiting torture do not automatically prevent it. Enforcement, oversight, cultural values, and institutional safeguards are all necessary to translate legal prohibitions into practical reality. As we near the end of our long journey through the shadows of medieval punishment, we pause to reflect on what we have learned. We have seen how torture was systematized, legalized, and routinized. We have examined the dungeons, the devices, the procedures. We have met the victims and the executioners. We have understood the legal frameworks and cultural contexts that made these practices possible. We have also seen how these practices declined, how societies moved away from judicial torture and public execution toward more humane forms of justice. This progress was real and significant, though never complete and always subject to reversal. In our final section, we will explore how medieval torture is remembered and commemorated, how it has shaped our modern consciousness, and what lessons we might draw from this dark chapter of human history. But for now, rest in the knowledge that the worst of these practices lie in the past, relics of a world we have largely left behind. The instruments of medieval torture and the places where it occurred have not entirely vanished from our world. Many have been preserved, curated, and displayed, becoming objects of historical study, tourist attractions, and cultural memory. How we remember and present this dark history reveals much about our contemporary values and anxieties. Across Europe, and increasingly in other parts of the world, torture museums have emerged as popular tourist destinations. These range from serious historical institutions to more sensationalized attractions that blur the line between education and entertainment. The medieval crime museum Mittelalterliches Kriminalmuseum in Rothenburg-Aurab der Tauber, Germany, is one of the most comprehensive. Established in 1936, it houses an extensive collection of instruments of punishment and torture, legal documents, and exhibits on medieval criminal justice. The museum presents torture in historical context, explaining the legal frameworks and cultural assumptions that made such practices possible. Walking through such a museum is a strange experience. Glass cases display thumb screws, iron maidens, masks of shame, and countless other devices. Detailed placards explain how each was used, what crimes warranted its application, how long it remained in use. The clinical presentation, the careful labeling, the historical documentation creates a cognitive dissonance. These objects of terrible suffering are presented like any other museum artifacts, with the same scholarly care that might be applied to pottery or paintings. Some exhibits include reconstructions of torture chambers, complete with mannequins positioned on racks or in stocks. These dioramas attempt to recreate the atmosphere of medieval dungeons: the dim lighting, the stone walls, the sinister instruments waiting to be used. The effect can be powerful, giving visitors a sense of what these spaces might have felt like, though of course without the actual terror and pain that defined them. Other notable torture museums include the Torture Museum in Amsterdam, the Museum of Torture Instruments in Prague, the Torture Museum in San Gimignano, Italy, and numerous others. Each has its own approach and emphasis, but all grapple with the challenge of presenting horrific history in a way that is educational rather than merely sensational. There is an inherent tension in torture museums. On one hand, they serve an educational function, preserving historical artifacts and teaching visitors about medieval justice. On the other hand, they risk turning suffering into spectacle, making entertainment out of torture. This tension is heightened by the fact that many visitors come to torture museums seeking exactly this kind of dark entertainment. The museums are popular precisely because torture is disturbing and macabre. People are drawn to the grotesque, to the forbidden, to that which shocks and disturbs. Torture museums cater to this fascination while trying to maintain educational legitimacy. Some museums lean more heavily into the sensational side. They emphasize the most dramatic and gruesome devices, present graphic descriptions of torture methods, and create atmospheric environments designed to thrill and frighten. These museums are more akin to haunted houses than historical institutions, though they are presented under the banner of education. Other museums take a more sober approach, emphasizing the legal and social context of torture, discussing the victims and the long process of abolition. They try to make visitors think rather than merely shudder. But even these serious museums must acknowledge that the objects themselves carry an inherent fascination that goes beyond pure historical interest. Critics of torture museums argue that they trivialize suffering, that they turn human agony into a tourist commodity. By displaying instruments of torture as curiosities, by inviting people to imagine medieval dungeons as atmospheric settings rather than places of real terror, these museums may undermine rather than enhance historical understanding. Defenders argue that preserving and displaying these artifacts serves an important purpose. Forgetting the horrors of the past makes us vulnerable to repeating them. By confronting the reality of what humans have done to each other, we might become more vigilant against contemporary forms of cruelty. The discomfort we feel viewing torture devices is not inappropriate, it is precisely the point. Beyond museums, many actual historical sites of torture and execution have been preserved and open to visitors. The Tower of London, with its long history as a prison and place of execution, is one of the most famous. Visitors can tour the dungeons where prisoners were held, see the room where torture was conducted, stand on the site where executions took place. The Bastille in Paris no longer exists. It was demolished during the French Revolution, but its site is marked and commemorated. Other prisons and fortresses across Europe offer tours that include their torture chambers and execution grounds. Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, the Doge's Palace in Venice, Kilmainham Jail in Dublin all invite visitors to walk through spaces of historical suffering. These sites engage in what scholars call dark tourism, travel to places associated with death, suffering, and tragedy. Dark tourism is not new. People have long been drawn to battlefields, disaster sites, and places of historical atrocity. But the commercialization and formalization of such tourism in recent decades raises questions about how we should relate to sites of suffering. Should we turn places where people were tortured and killed into tourist attractions? Is there a way to visit such sites that is respectful to the memory of those who suffered? Or does the very act of touristic consumption, buying tickets, taking photos, purchasing souvenirs inevitably trivialize the suffering that occurred there? Different sites handle these questions differently. Some emphasize somber remembrance with minimal commercialization and strong educational programming. Others are more commercial, with gift shops selling torture-themed merchandise, tour guides emphasizing gruesome details, and an overall atmosphere that feels more like entertainment than commemoration. The Tower of London, for instance, balances its role as a historical monument with its function as a tourist attraction. It houses the crown jewels and tells stories of pageantry and power alongside the darker histories of imprisonment and execution. The overall effect is complex. Visitors come away with a sense of British history in all its aspects, not just the dark ones. In some places, memorials have been erected to commemorate the victims of torture and unjust execution. These monuments serve a different function than torture museums. They focus on remembering and honoring those who suffered rather than displaying the instruments of their suffering. In Salem, Massachusetts, there is a memorial to the victims of the 1692 witch trials. Stone benches surround a small park, each inscribed with the name of someone who was executed. The memorial is somber and contemplative, inviting visitors to reflect on the injustice that occurred and to remember the individuals who died. In Bamberg, Germany, a monument commemorates the victims of the witch trials that occurred there in the 17th century. The monument lists the names of those executed and provides historical context about the trials. It serves as both a memorial and an educational resource. The Toleranzdenkmal in Augsburg commemorates victims of religious persecution and includes remembrance of those tortured and executed for their faith. Similar monuments exist in various European cities, marking sites of historical injustice and honoring those who suffered. These memorials often take a deliberately different approach than torture museums. They are quiet spaces for reflection, rather than displays of artifacts. They name victims, giving back some of the humanity that was stripped from them when they were reduced to tortured bodies. They acknowledge suffering without spectacularizing it. However, memorials also face challenges. Most victims of medieval torture are anonymous, no names survive, no individual stories are known. How do you memorialize the unnamed? How do you commemorate suffering when the historical record is fragmentary and incomplete? Some memorials respond to this by creating symbolic representations, a single figure standing for all victims, an abstract design suggesting suffering and loss. Others focus on the few victims whose names and stories are known, while acknowledging the countless others who remain nameless. One of the most important sources for understanding medieval and early modern torture is the archives of the various Inquisitions, particularly the Spanish Inquisition. These institutions kept meticulous records of their proceedings, including torture sessions, confessions, and sentences. The archives of the Spanish Inquisition, now housed in various Spanish archives and in the Vatican, contain thousands of cases documented in extraordinary detail. Scholars studying these archives have been able to reconstruct not just the legal procedures, but also the experiences of individuals who passed through the system. These archives serve a different memorial function than museums or monuments. They preserve not objects but stories, the voices of victims captured in the moment of their suffering, recorded by scribes who documented their every word. Reading these records is a haunting experience. The bureaucratic language cannot entirely mask the human reality, the fear, the pain, the desperate attempts to say whatever would make the torture stop. The archives also reveal the arbitrariness and inconsistency of justice. Similar crimes received vastly different punishments. Some individuals were tortured severely, others barely at all. The supposed rationality and procedural correctness of the system breaks down when confronted with the actual records of what happened to real people. Making these archives accessible to researchers and, increasingly, to the general public through digitization and translation ensures that these stories are not forgotten. The victims of the Inquisition left few other traces. Most were not wealthy or powerful. Most left no other historical records. The Inquisition archives are often the only place where their voices can still be heard. How medieval torture is remembered is sometimes contested and politicized. Different groups may have different stakes in how this history is told. The Catholic Church has a complicated relationship with the memory of the Inquisition. For centuries, the Church defended the Inquisition as a necessary institution that protected orthodoxy and saved souls. In recent decades, there has been more willingness to acknowledge the suffering caused and to express regret, though formal apologies have been limited. In 2000, Pope John Paul II offered a general apology for various historical sins of the Church, including coercion of conscience and use of violence in the service of truth. While this did not specifically address the Inquisition, it was understood to include it. This acknowledgement was significant, though critics argued it did not go far enough in confronting the specifics of what was done in the Church's name. Local and regional identities sometimes incorporate memories of persecution. Regions that were subjected to witch hunts or religious persecution may commemorate their victims as part of their historical identity. This remembrance can serve contemporary purposes, reinforcing local identity, critiquing central authority, or drawing parallels to contemporary injustices. In some cases, victims of medieval torture have been rehabilitated or even canonized. Joan of Arc, burned at the stake for heresy in 1431, was declared a martyr and canonized as a saint in 1920. Her transformation from condemned heretic to national hero and saint reflects changing political and religious contexts. Jan Hus, the Czech religious reformer burned at the stake in 1415, has been commemorated as a national hero in the Czech Republic. His death at the Council of Constance is remembered as an example of religious courage and resistance to oppression. These rehabilitations and commemorations show how the meaning of historical events can shift over time. Those who were once condemned can be later celebrated. The torture and execution that was once presented as justice can be reframed as persecution and martyrdom. Many of the torture devices displayed in museums are not actually medieval. They are later creations, sometimes from the 18th or 19th centuries, sometimes even more recent. The Iron Maiden, as we noted earlier, is largely a modern invention. Many other devices have questionable provenance. This raises difficult questions for museums and historians. Should devices be displayed even if their historical authenticity is uncertain? How should museums present objects that may be more myth than reality? Some museums have been more rigorous about this than others. The better museums clearly label which items are original historical artifacts and which are reproductions or items of questionable provenance. They provide context about the myths and exaggerations that have grown up around torture, helping visitors distinguish historical reality from later fantasy. Other museums are less scrupulous, displaying reproductions as if they were originals or presenting mythical devices as historical fact. This contributes to misunderstanding about medieval torture, making it seem more exotic and elaborate than it actually was, while potentially obscuring the more mundane but more common forms of torture that were actually used. The fascination with torture devices has led to a market for reproductions and fakes. Craftspeople create medieval torture devices for museums, private collectors, and entertainment venues. Some of these are clearly labeled as reproductions, others are presented ambiguously. The result is a blurring of lines between historical artifacts and modern creations. How torture museums and historic sites educate visitors varies enormously. The best institutions provide rich historical context, explaining the legal systems, cultural beliefs, and social structures that made torture possible. They discuss the process of abolition and draw connections to contemporary issues of human rights and criminal justice. Educational programs at these sites might include guided tours that explain the historical and legal context of torture, exhibits on the victims, giving names and stories where possible, discussions of how torture was eventually abolished, connections to contemporary issues like capital punishment, police brutality, and human rights. Primary source materials: trial records, legal codes, contemporary accounts, scholarly articles and books available for deeper study. Some institutions have developed particularly thoughtful educational approaches. They might include exhibits on wrongful convictions, on the unreliability of confessions obtained through torture, on the psychology of those who inflict torture. They make clear that this is not just ancient history, but has relevance to ongoing debates about justice, punishment, and human rights. Interactive elements in some museums allow visitors to engage more deeply with the material. Touchscreens might allow exploration of trial records. Video presentations might feature historians discussing specific cases. Reconstructions might be accompanied by audio that includes historical accounts read by actors. The challenge is to make the education engaging without sensationalizing. Torture is inherently dramatic, and disturbing it does not need artificial heightening. The best educational approaches let the historical reality speak for itself, while providing the context necessary to understand it. A particular challenge for torture museums is how to handle child visitors. Should children be exposed to this material at all? At what age? With what kind of mediation? Some museums set age restrictions, prohibiting children under a certain age, often 12 or 14, from entering. Others allow children, but provide warnings about graphic content and recommend parental guidance. Still others have no restrictions, treating torture exhibits like any other historical material. There are arguments on both sides. On one hand, children are capable of understanding historical injustice, and learning about the cruelty of the past might help develop empathy and moral awareness. On the other hand, exposure to graphic depictions of torture might be traumatizing or desensitizing, particularly for younger children. Parents and educators must make judgments about what is appropriate for individual children. Some children might be ready at a young age to grapple with this difficult history. Others might need to wait until they are older. Context matters. A visit to a serious historical museum with educational framing is different from a sensationalized torture chamber attraction. Many museums that allow children try to provide age-appropriate educational materials. They might have special tours or exhibits designed for younger visitors that address the history of punishment and justice without the most graphic details. They might emphasize the progress that has been made and the importance of protecting human rights. The cultural memory of medieval torture has been significantly shaped by horror entertainment movies, television shows, haunted house attractions, and video games that use torture as a source of thrills and scares. Films like The Name of the Rose, The Pit and the Pendulum, Black Death, and countless others depict medieval torture, often with considerable graphic detail. These depictions are rarely historically accurate in their specifics, but they shape popular imagination about what medieval torture was like. Haunted house attractions often include torture chamber sections, with actors portraying executioners and torture victims, animatronic devices simulating medieval tortures, and atmospheric design meant to evoke dungeon settings. These attractions are pure entertainment, making no pretense at historical accuracy, but they draw on and reinforce certain images and ideas about medieval torture. Video games set in medieval or fantasy settings often include torture as an element. Players might interrogate prisoners using torture, or might have to escape from torture chambers. The gamification of torture raises its own ethical questions. What does it mean to make torture into gameplay? Does this trivialize real suffering? This horror entertainment serves certain psychological functions. It allows safe exploration of fear and fascination with violence. It provides catharsis through controlled exposure to disturbing content. It can serve as social commentary, using historical torture as a metaphor for contemporary cruelties. However, horror entertainment also risks trivializing and distorting. The torture depicted in movies and games is designed for dramatic impact, not historical accuracy. The result can be a popular understanding of medieval torture that emphasizes the most sensational elements while missing the systematic, bureaucratic reality that was often more disturbing than any individual device. Beyond museums and popular culture, medieval torture is the subject of serious academic study. Historians, legal scholars, anthropologists, and others research the history of torture, punishment, and criminal justice. This research has significantly advanced our understanding. We now know more about the legal frameworks that govern torture, the actual frequency of its use, the demographics of victims, the processes of interrogation and trial. We understand better how torture functioned within broader social and political systems. Academic conferences on the history of punishment and criminal justice bring together researchers from around the world. Scholarly journals publish articles analyzing specific aspects of torture history. University presses publish books that make this research available to broader audiences. This scholarship serves multiple purposes. It recovers stories that might otherwise be forgotten. It corrects myths and misconceptions. It provides context for understanding contemporary issues. And it reminds us of the capacity for cruelty that lurks within human institutions, even those that claim to serve justice. Recent scholarship has paid particular attention to previously marginalized perspectives. Research on women's experiences of accusation and torture, on the persecution of minorities, on colonial applications of torture, all of this enriches our understanding and challenges earlier narratives that focused primarily on legal and institutional history. The memory of medieval torture is not just about the past, it resonates with contemporary concerns. Debates about enhanced interrogation techniques, about prison conditions, about police brutality, about capital punishment, all of these invoke, directly or indirectly, the history we have been exploring. When we learn about medieval torture, we cannot help but think about contemporary forms of state violence. The Abu Ghraib scandal, the revelations about CIA torture programs, the ongoing debates about Guantanamo Bay. These are not medieval history, but they echo it. The justifications offered for modern torture, national security, the need for information, the exceptional nature of certain threats parallel the justifications offered in medieval times. This recognition can lead to different conclusions. Some argue that the persistence of torture despite centuries of legal prohibition shows how deeply rooted the impulse to torture is in human nature and in power structures. Others argue that the long history of struggle against torture, culminating in its formal abolition, shows that moral progress is possible, and that we must continue fighting against torture in all its forms. The memory of medieval torture can serve as a warning, a reminder of what humans are capable of when cruelty is legitimized and systematized. It can motivate us to be vigilant about protecting human rights, to question state power, to demand accountability for those who torture. But it can also serve less constructive purposes. The invocation of medieval torture in contemporary debates can be a form of distancing. We are not as bad as the medieval torturers that obscures, rather than illuminates contemporary abuses. The assumption that we have moved beyond such barbarism can make us complacent about forms of cruelty that persist in different guises. The shadow of medieval torture stretches long across our cultural landscape, appearing in literature, art, film, and other media. How torture has been represented in culture both reflects and shapes our understanding of this dark history. Medieval literature itself rarely depicted torture in detail. While chronicles and legal documents recorded tortures and executions, imaginative literature tended to avoid graphic depictions. There were exceptions. Accounts of saints' martyrdoms described their tortures, but these were meant to inspire faith through the saints' endurance, not to dwell on the suffering itself. The literature of courtly love and chivalry mentioned torture obliquely when it occurred in the background of stories, but it was not a central theme. Medieval romance celebrated virtue, honor, and love. Torture was antithetical to these values and appeared rarely in such tales. Dante's Inferno, written in the early 14th century, depicted elaborate tortures in hell, but these were divine punishments for sin, not judicial torture. Dante's tortures were symbolic and eternal, designed to fit the crime in a cosmic system of justice. While his imagery was vivid and sometimes drew on contemporary punishment methods, his purpose was theological rather than documentary. As we move into the early modern period, torture begins to appear more frequently in literature. Shakespeare's plays occasionally reference torture. King Lear on the rack of this tough world, the torture of conscience in Macbeth. But again, these are mostly metaphorical uses. The actual depiction of physical torture is rare in Shakespeare. The exception is in accounts of martyrdom, both Catholic and Protestant. As the Reformation created religious divisions, both sides produced literature celebrating their martyrs who had suffered torture and death for their faith. John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, 1563, described in graphic detail the tortures suffered by Protestant martyrs under Catholic rule. Catholic counterparts did the same for Catholic martyrs under Protestant regimes. These martyrologies served both religious and political purposes. They demonstrated the righteousness of the cause through the willingness of martyrs to endure suffering. They demonized the opposition by depicting them as cruel torturers, and they inspired readers to similar steadfastness in faith. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the rise of Gothic literature, which made extensive use of medieval torture as an element of horror and atmosphere. Novels like Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, 1764, Anne Radcliffe's The Italian, 1797, and Matthew Lewis's The Monk, 1796, featured dungeons, secret tribunals, threatened tortures, and inquisitorial proceedings. These Gothic novels were not historically accurate. They exaggerated and sensationalized medieval torture for dramatic effect. The Spanish Inquisition became a particular favorite, depicted as far more cruel and arbitrary than historical evidence suggests. The black legend of Spanish cruelty was reinforced and elaborated through Gothic fiction. Yet these novels served a purpose beyond mere entertainment. They allowed readers to explore fears about religious and political authority, about the abuse of power, about the vulnerability of the individual before institutional might. The medieval or early modern settings provided distance that made such explorations safer. These were not contemporary issues, but historical ones, so they could be addressed without direct political danger. Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum, 1842, is perhaps the most famous short story to feature inquisitorial torture. Poe's story, set during the Spanish Inquisition, describes a prisoner subjected to psychological and physical tortures. The pit, the descending pendulum blade, the contracting heated walls. The story is more psychological horror than historical fiction, using the Inquisition setting to explore themes of helplessness, fear, and the anticipation of death. The Victorian period saw continued fascination with medieval cruelty, often in the context of historical novels. Robert Louis Stevenson's The Black Arrow, 1888, and other historical adventures included scenes of medieval justice and punishment. These were generally more restrained than Gothic excess, but still emphasized the cruel and arbitrary nature of medieval law. Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, 1889, used medieval torture as a way of critiquing both medieval society and Twain's own contemporary America. The time-traveling protagonist is horrified by the casual cruelty of medieval justice, but Twain makes clear parallels to American slavery and other contemporary injustices. In the 20th century, torture moved from primarily historical settings to contemporary ones. While medieval torture still appeared in historical fiction, modern torture became a more common theme, reflecting the brutal realities of world wars, totalitarian regimes, and colonial violence. However, medieval settings remained popular for exploring torture in fiction. The medieval period provided distance. Readers could confront cruelty and suffering in a context removed from their immediate reality. Fantasy literature, drawing on medieval Europe for inspiration, often included torture as an element, from Tolkien's relatively restrained references to torture in Mordor to George R.R. Martin's more graphic depictions in A Song of Ice and Fire. Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, 1980, featured the medieval Inquisition and included depictions of interrogation and torture. Eco, a medieval scholar, brought historical knowledge to his fiction, creating a more nuanced portrait of medieval justice than most popular treatments, while still crafting a compelling narrative. Visual media has brought medieval torture to life in ways that literature could only suggest. From early cinema to contemporary television, depictions of medieval torture have been a staple of historical and fantasy productions. Early films dealing with medieval subjects often included torture scenes, though censorship codes limited what could be shown. As these codes relaxed in the 1960s and 1970s, depictions became more graphic. Films like Mark of the Devil, 1970, pushed boundaries with explicit torture scenes, marketed with warnings about the disturbing content. More recently, films have ranged from relatively restrained historical dramas to graphic horror. The Name of the Rose, 1986, adapted Eco's novel with some torture scenes but within the context of a serious historical mystery. Black Death, 2010, depicted medieval plague, witch hunting, and torture with considerable graphic violence. Television series, particularly in the streaming era, have featured medieval torture prominently. Game of Thrones included numerous torture scenes, sometimes extended over multiple episodes. While set in a fantasy world, the medieval-inspired setting made these scenes resonate with historical associations. The challenge for filmmakers is balancing historical authenticity with entertainment value and ethical responsibility. Some films strive for historical accuracy, consulting with historians and depicting torture as it likely occurred. Others use medieval settings as an excuse for spectacular violence that has little relation to historical reality. There is also the question of purpose. Is torture being depicted to educate viewers about historical reality, to create suspense and horror, to explore themes about power and cruelty, or simply for shock value? The same scene might serve different purposes, depending on context and framing. Video games have brought a new dimension to cultural representations of torture interactivity. In games, players don't just watch torture depicted, they sometimes participate in it, either as torturer or victim. Medieval and fantasy games often include torture as an element. Players might interrogate prisoners using torture to extract information. They might have to escape from torture chambers. They might witness torture as part of the game's narrative. This interactivity raises unique ethical questions. When torture is something you do in a game, rather than something you observe, does it have different psychological effects? Does it normalize violence? Or is it clearly understood as fictional and no different from other forms of simulated violence in games? Research on this question has produced mixed results. Some studies suggest that violent video games can increase aggressive thoughts and behaviors in the short term. Others find minimal or no effects. The debate continues, with strong opinions on all sides. What is clear is that video games represent torture in particular ways. It is often simplified and gamified, reduced to a mechanic where you press buttons to increase pain levels until the character confesses. This strips away the historical, legal, and human complexity of actual torture, presenting it as a simple transaction: apply pain, receive information. Some games have tried to grapple more seriously with torture. Spec Ops: The Line 2012, though set in a modern rather than medieval context, forced players to commit acts of violence including torture, then confronted them with the consequences, making them question their choices. Few medieval games have attempted similar moral complexity. Visual arts have long depicted torture, from medieval manuscripts illustrating saints' martyrdoms to contemporary art engaging with themes of pain and power. Medieval and Renaissance art included many depictions of martyrdom, showing saints being tortured and executed. These were devotional images meant to inspire piety through contemplation of the saints' suffering and faith. The torture was depicted with varying degrees of graphic detail, but always in a religious context. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch included torture in their depictions of hell and damnation. Bosch's triptych showed elaborate and fantastical tortures, using medieval torture devices as inspiration for infernal punishments. Later artists used torture scenes for different purposes. Francisco Goya's Disasters of War series 1810-1820 depicted torture and execution during the Napoleonic Wars, using these images to critique the cruelty of war. While not medieval, Goya's work drew on the visual vocabulary of torture that had developed over centuries. Contemporary artists have engaged with the legacy of torture in various ways. Some create works that explicitly reference medieval torture, drawing parallels to contemporary abuses. Others use the aesthetics of torture, dark spaces, instruments of pain, vulnerable bodies to explore themes of power, suffering, and resistance. The Chilean artist Guillermo Núñez created works referencing torture under the Pinochet dictatorship, sometimes incorporating historical references to medieval torture chambers. The South African artist William Kentridge has created prints and animations that reference torture, drawing connections between historical and contemporary violence. All of these cultural representations, literary, cinematic, artistic, raise a fundamental question: is it possible to represent torture without aestheticizing it? When torture becomes art, entertainment, or cultural spectacle, does this inevitably trivialize or distort the reality of suffering? Some argue that representation is necessary, that we must confront the reality of torture, even in disturbing forms, to understand it and resist it. Silence and avoidance serve no one. Cultural representations, even imperfect ones, keep the memory alive and can provoke moral reflection. Others worry that cultural representations, particularly in entertainment media, make torture consumable and even pleasurable. Viewers enjoy the thrill of torture scenes in movies. Readers are gripped by descriptions of suffering in novels. This enjoyment of represented suffering, even fictional suffering, may desensitize us to real torture and make it seem less morally urgent. There is probably no fully satisfying answer to this dilemma. Cultural representation is inevitable. Torture is part of human history and will continue to appear in art and entertainment. The question is not whether to represent torture, but how to do so responsibly, with awareness of the ethical stakes and respect for those who actually suffered. As we near the end of our long journey through the dark corridors of medieval torture and punishment, we must ask, what does this history teach us? What relevance does medieval torture have for our contemporary world? These are not merely academic questions, but urgent moral and practical ones. The first and most sobering lesson is that torture persists. Despite formal abolition in the 18th and 19th centuries, despite international treaties and laws prohibiting it, torture continues in many parts of the world today. According to Amnesty International and other human rights organizations, torture occurs in a majority of countries worldwide. Police torture suspects to extract confessions. Military forces torture prisoners for information. Authoritarian regimes torture dissidents and political opponents. The methods may have changed. Medieval racks and wheels have been replaced by electric shocks, waterboarding, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, but the fundamental dynamic remains the infliction of suffering to break human will. Why does torture persist despite centuries of moral and legal opposition? Several factors contribute. The utility myth. There persists a belief, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that torture works, that it produces reliable information. This belief is reinforced by fictional representations, where torture routinely produces truthful confessions and saves lives. The reality that torture produces unreliable information and false confessions is less cinematically satisfying and less widely believed. Dehumanization. Torture is easier when victims are dehumanized, seen as terrorists, criminals, enemies, others who are fundamentally different from us. This dehumanization creates moral distance, making cruelty seem permissible or even necessary. Medieval torture relied on similar dynamics. Heretics, witches, criminals were not quite fully human, and thus could be subjected to treatment that would be unconscionable for respectable people. Institutional dynamics. Organizations that torture develop cultures that normalize and perpetuate it. Medieval torture persisted partly because it became institutionalized, built into legal systems, carried out by professionals, justified by elaborate legal codes. Modern torture often follows similar patterns, becoming routine within certain institutional contexts. Secrecy and impunity. Torture thrives in darkness. When it is hidden from public view, when perpetrators are not held accountable, it becomes easier to continue. Medieval torture was often public, which created some constraints. Modern torture is typically hidden, which removes even those limited checks. Emergency logic. Both medieval and modern torture are often justified as responses to exceptional threats. In medieval times, the threat was heresy or witchcraft endangering souls and social order. Today, it is terrorism or other security threats. The logic is the same. Extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures, and normal moral constraints can be suspended. Medieval torture teaches us important lessons about the relationship between law and justice. The medieval system showed how legal frameworks can legitimize cruelty, how procedure can mask brutality, how the language of justice can be used to authorize injustice. Medieval torture was legal. It was not arbitrary violence, but state action conducted according to rules and procedures. This should give us pause about equating legality with morality. Just because something is legal does not make it right. Legal systems can be profoundly unjust, and law can be a tool of oppression as much as a protection against it. The medieval requirement for confession. and the use of torture to obtain it, reveals the danger of privileging confession over other forms of evidence. Modern criminal justice systems still struggle with this. False confessions continue to be a major cause of wrongful convictions, particularly when confessions are obtained through coercive interrogation that, while not rising to the level of torture, nevertheless pressure innocent people to confess to crimes they did not commit. The medieval system also shows the importance of procedural safeguards and their limitations. Medieval law had numerous supposed protections. Torture required judicial authorization, could only be used when there was already substantial evidence, had to be conducted in the presence of officials. Confessions had to be confirmed freely. Yet these protections were routinely evaded or ignored. This teaches us that procedural safeguards, while important, are not sufficient if there is not also a culture of rights and a genuine commitment to limiting state power. One reason medieval torture was possible was limited empathy, the inability or unwillingness to imagine oneself in the position of the torture victim. As we discussed earlier, empathy in the medieval period was more restricted, extending primarily to those within one's own social group. Expanding the circle of empathy has been one of the great moral achievements of modernity. The idea that all humans, regardless of social status, ethnicity, religion, or any other characteristic, possess equal dignity and deserve equal protection, this was not a medieval idea. It developed gradually through centuries of moral and political struggle. Yet empathy remains fragile and limited. We still find it easier to empathize with those like us than with those who seem different. Victims of torture today are often those who have been othered: foreign nationals, suspected terrorists, members of marginalized groups. Extending empathy to these individuals, imagining their suffering as vividly as we would imagine our own, remains a moral challenge. Studying medieval torture can help exercise our moral imagination. When we read accounts of torture victims, when we imagine the experience of waiting in a dungeon for interrogation, when we contemplate the breaking of a human being on the rack, we are practicing empathy across vast distances of time and culture. This practice can strengthen our capacity for empathy with contemporary torture victims. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, developed in her analysis of Nazi war crimes, applies equally to medieval torture. The executioners, torturers, judges, and officials who carried out medieval torture were not monsters, but ordinary people doing what their society told them was necessary and just. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson, that good people can participate in terrible systems. The judge who ordered torture believed he was serving justice. The torturer who operated the rack thought he was fulfilling a necessary social function. The scribe who documented the proceedings saw himself as a careful administrator. None of these people likely thought of themselves as cruel or evil. This should make us deeply skeptical of our own moral certainty. We like to think that we would have been among the few who opposed torture, who saw its cruelty and spoke against it. But the reality is that most of us, placed in that time and culture, would probably have accepted torture as normal and necessary, just as most people then did. This recognition should make us vigilant about our own time and culture. What practices do we currently accept as normal and necessary that future generations will look back on with horror? How might we be participating in systems of cruelty without fully recognizing them as such? While the persistence of torture is sobering, the decline and formal abolition of judicial torture represents genuine moral progress. Societies can change. Practices that were once normal and legally sanctioned can be rejected and prohibited. The abolition of torture was not inevitable. It required intellectual critique, moral courage, legal reform, and institutional change. It shows that human societies can become more humane, that moral progress is possible even if it is never guaranteed or irreversible. This should encourage us in contemporary struggles against torture and other forms of cruelty. Change is possible. What seems entrenched and immovable can be challenged and overthrown. The same intellectual tools that Enlightenment thinkers used to critique judicial torture, reason, evidence, appeals to human dignity, remain available to us. However, the history of torture also teaches that progress can be reversed. Torture was formally abolished in Europe yet returned in the 20th century under various totalitarian regimes. Democratic societies that had long rejected torture engaged in it during the War on Terror. Legal prohibitions, even international treaties, are not sufficient protection if the political will to enforce them is lacking. This means that the struggle against torture is never finished. Each generation must recommit to human rights, must resist the temptations of torture, must hold accountable those who practice it. Complacency is dangerous. The assumption that we are beyond such barbarism, that torture is something other people do in other times and places. Medieval torture should inoculate us against this complacency. It shows how easily cruelty can become systematized, how legal frameworks can legitimize suffering, how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil. These dynamics are not unique to the medieval period. They are perennial temptations that we must continually resist. This is why the memory of medieval torture matters. Not as entertainment or spectacle, not as self-congratulation about how far we have come, but as warning and instruction. The dungeons, the torture devices, the documented cases, these are not merely historical curiosities, but testaments to human capacity for cruelty. They remind us of what can happen when power is unchecked, when legal systems prioritize order over justice, when empathy fails. They also honor the victims. Most of those who suffered torture in medieval dungeons are anonymous. We do not know their names, their stories, their individual humanity. But we know they existed. They felt pain as acutely as we do. They feared and hoped and loved. By remembering the system that destroyed them, we acknowledge their suffering and commit ourselves to preventing similar suffering in our own time. Medieval torture presents us with an interesting moral challenge. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to condemn. From our comfortable position centuries later, we can clearly see the injustice and cruelty of medieval torture. We can judge the torturers and those who authorized torture harshly. But this clarity can be misleading. It can make us think that moral questions are always this clear, that we would always recognize injustice when we see it. The reality is that moral clarity is often only available in retrospect. People living in the medieval period, embedded in their culture and legal system, did not have our perspective. They saw torture as normal, necessary, even just. This should make us humble about our own moral judgments. What seems clear to us now might seem differently to future generations. Practices we currently accept might someday be condemned. This is not moral relativism. Torture was wrong even when it was legal and widely accepted. But it is moral humility, a recognition that we too are embedded in our time and culture, and may not see all the ways in which we fail to live up to our highest values. One temptation when studying medieval torture is to engage in a kind of competitive suffering, to debate whether medieval torture was worse than modern torture, whether the rack was more cruel than waterboarding, whether the slow death by breaking wheel was more or less humane than the electric chair. These comparisons are both inevitable and problematic. They are inevitable because the human mind naturally compares and contrasts. They are problematic because they risk creating hierarchies of suffering that can trivialize or excuse certain forms of cruelty. The truth is that all torture is cruel. Whether the methods are medieval or modern, the essential dynamic is the same: the deliberate infliction of suffering to break human will. The specific techniques matter less than the fundamental violation of human dignity. What we can learn from comparing medieval and modern torture is not which is worse, but how different contexts produce different forms of cruelty. Medieval torture was public, legally codified, and religiously justified. Modern torture is often hidden, denied, and justified through security discourse. Understanding these differences helps us recognize and resist torture in its various forms. The history of medieval torture raises questions about individual responsibility within unjust systems. Can we blame the individual torturer who was simply doing his job, following orders, carrying out legal procedures? Or should we focus on the system that made torture legal and normal? The answer, unsatisfyingly, is both. Individuals who tortured bear responsibility for their actions, even when those actions were legal and socially sanctioned. The Nuremberg trials after World War II established that following orders is not an excuse for atrocity. This principle applies to medieval torturers as well, even if we cannot hold them accountable centuries after their deaths. At the same time, focusing only on individual wrongdoers without addressing systemic issues is insufficient. The medieval torture system persisted not because of a few evil individuals, but because of legal structures, cultural beliefs, institutional practices, and social norms that made torture possible and acceptable. Changing such systems requires more than punishing individual perpetrators. It requires legal reform, cultural change, institutional restructuring. This dual focus on both individual responsibility and systemic change is as relevant today as it was in medieval times. We must hold individuals who torture accountable while also working to change the systems, policies, and cultures that enable torture. We end our exploration on a note of cautious hope. The history of medieval torture is dark, but it is not the whole story. Alongside the cruelty, there were also acts of mercy, expressions of compassion, and eventually successful movements for reform. Some prisoners maintained their dignity and humanity, even under torture. Some officials showed mercy when they could. Some thinkers questioned and criticized the system. And eventually, after centuries of struggle, torture was abolished, at least formally, at least in law. This shows something important about human nature. We are capable of terrible cruelty, yes. The medieval torture system proves that beyond doubt, but we are also capable of moral courage, of compassion, of progress. The same species that invented the rack also developed human rights law. The same capacity for reason that created elaborate legal justifications for torture also produced the arguments that demolished those justifications. Human dignity, the idea that each person possesses inherent worth that must be respected, is both fragile and resilient. Medieval torture violated that dignity systematically and thoroughly. Yet the idea of human dignity survived, was articulated more clearly, became a foundation for modern human rights. This is grounds for hope, even as we remain vigilant against the ever-present temptations of cruelty. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our long journey through the dungeons and torture chambers of medieval Europe. We have descended into dark places, confronted difficult truths, examined instruments of suffering and the systems that created them. We have met the victims, those whose names we know, and the countless anonymous individuals who suffered and died in medieval prisons and on medieval scaffolds. We have tried to understand their experiences, to honor their suffering by not looking away from it. We have examined the perpetrators not as monsters, but as humans, trying to understand how ordinary people could participate in extraordinary cruelty. We have seen how legal systems, cultural beliefs, and social structures can normalize brutality and make the unthinkable seem routine. We have traced the decline of torture, understanding it as both intellectual achievement and ongoing struggle. The formal abolition of torture represented real progress, even as torture persists in new forms. And we have reflected on what this history teaches us about justice and law, about empathy and moral imagination, about the banality of evil and the possibility of progress, about individual responsibility and systemic change. The dungeons we have explored tonight exist now only as museum exhibits and historical sites. The torture devices we have discussed are artifacts behind glass, no longer instruments of suffering but objects of historical study. The legal codes that authorize torture have been replaced by human rights laws that prohibit it. This is progress, real, significant, hard-won progress. The world of medieval torture is not our world. We should be grateful for this, and should never take it for granted. But we should also remember that the distance between that world and ours is smaller than we might think. The same dynamics that made medieval torture possible, the dehumanization of others, the belief that security justifies cruelty, the failure of empathy, the normalization of brutality within systems, these remain with us. They emerge in different forms, under different names, but they are recognizably similar. So we remember medieval torture not to feel superior to our ancestors, but to understand ourselves better. We remember it not to dwell on the darkness, but to appreciate the light and to guard it carefully. We remember it not to despair about human cruelty, but to recognize human capacity for both cruelty and compassion, both brutality and mercy. The victims of medieval torture left few traces. Most were not powerful or wealthy. Most left no written records, no monuments, no individual legacies. Their suffering was recorded in trial transcripts and torture logs, bureaucratic documents written by their tormentors. These are often the only places where their voices can still be heard, muffled and distorted though they are. By studying this history, by refusing to look away from it, we honor these victims in the only way now possible by remembering that they existed, that they suffered, that they mattered, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that such systematic cruelty, such state-sanctioned torture, such casual destruction of human dignity does not return. The dungeons are empty now, the torture chambers silent. The wheels have stopped turning, the fires have burned out, the ropes have rotted away. These instruments of suffering have become historical artifacts, testimonies to cruelty that once was but need not be again. As you drift towards sleep, let these dark histories settle into their proper place. They are real, they are important, they have lessons to teach us. But they are also past. The night of medieval torture has ended, and while darkness persists in new forms, so too does the light of human rights, of dignity, of the long struggle against cruelty. Sleep well, traveler through time. The journey has been long and difficult, but you have walked it with courage and compassion. Tomorrow's light will come, as it always does, bringing with it new challenges and new opportunities to choose mercy over cruelty, dignity over degradation, justice over mere punishment. The past cannot be changed, but the future remains unwritten. We carry the lessons of history forward, using them to build a world more just, more merciful, more humane than what has come before. And in that ongoing work, the work of every generation to resist cruelty and uphold dignity, the victims of medieval torture are finally vindicated. Their suffering was not meaningless. It teaches us, it warns us, it motivates us to do better. So rest now. Let the stories settle. Let the darkness of the past give way to the possibilities of the present and future. The dungeons are closed, the torture chambers are museums, and you are safe in your bed, free to sleep without fear of the tortures that haunted other sleepers in other centuries. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle.